Good evening. My name is Sonia, and I'm from the Harbor Coalition Against the War. Before we get started, I just wanted to let you know we're live streaming this, and that if you could please turn your phones on vibrate, that would be really helpful. Also, I'd like to express gratitude to the Journey of Faith Church for allowing us to use their facilities. This is not the first time we've used their facilities. We've had Medea Benjamin from Code Pink here also speaking. Journey of Faith is a great part of our community, and we're very grateful to be able to be here. And before we get started, also, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items and announcements. First off, there's bathrooms over there near the other exit. There's two exits. There's an exit over there. There's two bathrooms. Also, we have sign-in sheets. We plan on having other speakers, so such as Medea Benjamin and Scott Ritter. So if you want to get information about future events, please sign in and have it at the front of the door there. Also, I wanted to let you know that we also protest every Friday at 5:30 at Fifth and Liberty in front of the main post office. So you're welcome to join us. We protest for peace. Also, we have a new website, and our Coalition Against War has a new website. Please feel free to check that out. It's, we will have the announcements and other things on there also. Also, we will be probably posting this event after we've live streamed it, and so you can look for it there. We will also, by the way, have another event with Scott tomorrow at the main library at noon in Ann Arbor. It will also be live streamed. So we will have time for questions at the end of the guest, after our guest has given his presentation. So just to let you know that there will be that opportunity. So tonight we are going to focus on this very limited topic, alleviating suffering for the people in Ukraine, and how or why we ought to or ought not to make terms with Putin and the country of Russia. Then we have peace with Putin. And in order to do this, we are going to be respectful listeners and afterwards respectful questions. Please feel free to ask hard, challenging questions, but in a respectful and civil manner. So I would like to, in order to create an atmosphere of community and respect, if you could take a minute just to introduce yourself to your neighbors, and so that we can start off in a manner of
Hey, neighbor.
We're on Anishinaabe territory right now. The people, the three council parties, the land under our feet.
Oh, okay.
And the Veterans for Peace helped me to go to Standing Rock with the group. It was amazing. When I was talking about Bob about genocide, and he's focused on some of the Soviet, we're going to have to say one of these genocides, I think there probably were some. It's a Soviet attempt. You know Jordan Peterson?
Yeah.
I listen to him sometimes just to get a feel for all of that. And he says communism came out of the Judeo-Christian
we're all here trying to learn and figure this all out together.
Sacrifice people to be present to that vision. I think we need to take a look at that about how we view ourselves, the genocides that happen under our feet, as well as anything that ever happened. Because we have a bloody history as human beings.
Okay. I just got to get focused for.
Sources of information. Many of you may already know that just 37 years ago, there were 50 companies in charge of most of American media. Now, 90% of the media in the U.S. is controlled by just 6 corporations. In addition, with the growth of media conglomerates in the U.S. since the 1980s, there has been massive cuts in the budgets for investigative journalism. A 2002 study concluded that investigative journalism has all but disappeared from the nation's commercial airwaves. So we must, as citizens of this country, seek out other sources of information, especially now because of the very dangerous situation we find ourselves in globally. As a U.S. Senator in 1918 once said, truth is the first casualty of war. So once again, I am so pleased to see you all here tonight and honored to introduce our special guest speaker. He is a necessary voice challenging the mainstream media. Many of you may already know Scott Ritter, but his list of credentials is long. Former U.S. Marine intelligence officer who served in the former Soviet Union, implementing arms control agreements, and on the staff with General Schwarzkopf during the Gulf War. Mr. Ritter served as a chief weapons inspector for the UN in Iraq, after which he came to prominence correctly stating that Iraq did not have weapons of mass destruction. He's testified before a combined armed service foreign affairs hearing of the U.S. Senate and before the House Foreign Relations and National Security Committees. He has spoken to NATO, the United Nations, the British, Canadian, Italian, French, Iraqi, Japanese, and European parliaments. He has had speaking engagements in Harvard, MIT, Brown, Dartmouth, Cornell, Yale, and Columbia, and dozens of other private and public universities and colleges across the country. He has spoken before the Council on Foreign Affairs, the Royal United Service Institute in London, and various World Affairs Councils. He is also an author of a number of books covering arms control, the Middle East, and national security. Two of his books, by the way, are here on sale. His latest book is here too. His most recent book, Disarmament in the Time of Perestroika, Arms Control and the End of the Soviet Union, is the definitive history of the implementation of the INF Treaty signed by Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan. The negotiations of the INF Treaty offer us hope that world powers can peacefully negotiate complex situations. Having served in the Soviet Union and being an expert on military affairs, Scott offers an alternative perspective to the war in Ukraine that you will not hear in the mainstream media. A courageous critic of the U.S. military policy, speaking out when others will not. Please help me welcome Scott Ritter.
Thank you. Wow. I don't know about you, but I'm intimidated by that introduction. What you missed, though, is that you can add at the bottom, I'm speaking in Ann Arbor, too. It's an honor and a privilege to be here tonight to speak with you about a topic that's a very difficult topic. First of all, we're talking about war. And I think sometimes in the dialogue, the national dialogue that we have about what's going on in Ukraine, we sort of run through that part. Yeah, there's a war in Ukraine, and then this, that, and the other thing. Ladies and gentlemen, there's a war in Ukraine. Hundreds of thousands of people are dead. Millions of people are displaced. Hundreds of thousands more will die. It's inevitable. You can't change it. It's going to happen. Cities are being destroyed, villages are being razed, and lives are being forever changed. It's a war going on right now. And the reason why I say that is everything we're going to talk about this must be captured in that environment. This ain't a joke. This isn't political science. This isn't a history lesson. This is visceral. People are dying. There are consequences that have to be factored in when we discuss issues such as, how do we get out of this? You know, that's a big one. People are dying. How do we get out of this? Understand that if we don't answer that question, people will continue to die. How do we get out of this? You know, there's an old saying when I was in the Marine Corps that you can't solve a problem unless you accurately define it first. I mean, just think about it. It's common sense. If I don't define the problem, what solution am I coming up? What am I solving? If I say I have the solution, but then when I say this is what the problem is, I get it wrong, I'm not solving anything. I'm wasting time, effort. We have a problem in Ukraine. How did this war start? Because if you don't understand that, you can't talk about a solution. Let me give you an example. Right now, it's very vogue in the West to talk about a negotiated settlement. You hear this over and over again. It's funny though. If we had talked last month, people like the Secretary General of NATO would have said, this is a situation that must be resolved on the battlefield. You heard a whole bunch of Western politicians saying, this is going to be solved on the battlefield. That's why we're giving the Ukrainians weapons. This is an issue that will be solved on the battlefield. Well, guess who agrees with that? Russia. They're solving this issue on the battlefield, and they're going to win. And that victory, that Russian victory, is inevitable. It's going to happen, ladies and gentlemen. There's nothing anybody can do to stop it. I'm just here to give you that straight up, definitive answer. I'll give you the short end of it. It's called burn rate and replenishment rate. Simple military math. All right? Burn rate. That's a funny way of saying people dying. Ukrainians are suffering casualties at a rate of between 500 and 1,000 dead per day. 500 to 1,000 dead per day. The Russians are suffering casualties at 1/10 of that rate. That means the Russians are losing 50 to 100 dead per day. Just keep in mind, in Vietnam, America at the height of the war was losing 200 dead per week. And we said, oh my God, we were losing too many people. Well, right now the Russians are losing 50 to 100 dead per day. Ukrainians are losing 500 to 1,000 dead per day. That's the burn rate. Then there's the equipment. Equipment is being destroyed in numbers that are unimaginable. Tanks, armored fighting vehicles, artillery, drones, you name it, it's been deployed and it's being destroyed. Replenishment rate now. Ukrainians have in the pipeline about 40,000 troops being trained by the West right now that should show up on the battlefield sometime in early spring. They may or may not be equipped, you see, because despite the fact that we spend billions of dollars training them, we don't have any more equipment to give them. We've given them everything we can. If we give them anything else, it eats into our ability to defend our nation if ever called upon to go to war. This includes not only artillery pieces, but the ammunition. When the United States produces 225 to 250,000 rounds of 155 millimeter ammunition per year, most people would say, wow, that's a lot. Until you see what happens in the war in Ukraine, where the Ukrainians are firing 20 to 30,000 rounds per day. Now, I'm a Marine, I don't know too much about math, but I do know that if you take 20,000 and put it into 200,000, you get about 10. That's 10 days. We put it to 250,000, let's just go ahead and just say 2 weeks. So we produce enough ammunition in 1 year to supply the Ukrainian ammunition burn rate for 2 weeks. We're out of ammunition. We got nothing left to give them. All the ammunition that the Ukrainians use for their Soviet era weapons that are incompatible with the weapons we provided them, they burn through those. They don't have any ammunition for that either. It's so bad now that the United States is going to the former Warsaw Pact countries and saying, can you please bring up to speed the production lines that you used to have for old Soviet ammunition, 122, 152 millimeter ammunition. Bring it up to speed. And they're saying, yes, we're going to do that, but it's going to cost money and it's going to take time. Money we have, time they don't. It's going to take years to get these production lines up and running. Years. Ukrainians, high burn rate, low replenishment rate. Russia, just the opposite. Low burn rate. You know, a lot of people talk about the tremendous victories that the Ukrainians had recently, starting in September, where they recaptured the Kharkov region in the north. And then in Kherson, where they took over the city and the bank that's on, depending, I have to admit, you know, being simple Marine, sometimes I get things wrong. I look at a map of the Dnieper River and I go left bank, right bank, because I'm looking at the math of north-south orientation. I realize actually it's wrong because you go left bank, right bank based on the flow of the river. So you actually have to flip it over left bank, right bank. So I got to make sure I get it right. It's the right bank of the river which is the left if you're looking at the map north and south. But the bottom line is the bank that used to be occupied by the Russians is now occupied by the Ukrainians. And people are calling this a wonderful victory, an outstanding victory. Well, in the Kharkov offensive, let me put it this way. If I told you that the Ukrainians launched an attack and they took over tens of thousands of square kilometers, would you say that's a victory? Most people say, yeah, that's an impressive victory. I say, okay, now forget about the territory. The Ukrainians launched an attack and they lost 20 to 30,000 men and they killed 200 to 300 men. Who won that battle? Not the guys that lost 20 to 30,000 men. Now we go to Kherson. The month of October and the fighting for the Kherson bridgehead, we'll call it. Ukraine lost 12,000 men. Russia lost 1,500. Who's won that battle? It ain't the Ukrainians. Burn rate, replenishment rate. The Russians gave up territory because they care about their manpower. They weren't willing to sacrifice lives to hold on to territory that we're dealing with a very transitional phase. Give up territory, save lives, bring in your reserves, and this is a big part, recapture territory. That's the Russian plan. You see, their burn rate is low because they aren't willing to sacrifice tens of thousands of men for futile objectives. They gave up territory to preserve life. Then they mobilized 300,000 men. Replenishment rate. The Russians will have, starting this month, 10 to 15 divisions worth of trained, equipped combat formations arriving on the battlefield. Ukraine's got nothing. Nothing new's coming in. Russia's going to win this war, ladies and gentlemen, and there's not anything anybody can do to stop it. So now we have to ask, we'll get to questions in a second. Now we have to ask the question, where do we go from here? Do we allow this war to continue to its inevitable conclusion? Or do we try to take an off-ramp? Now, most peace activists will say the off-ramp. Take the off-ramp. Stop the war now. And that's okay, except one, the Ukrainians don't want to stop the war now, because to stop the war now, they would have to acknowledge that they've lost 20% of their country. That is the 4 oblasts, Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Lugansk, that have been absorbed into Russia through a annexation process that many people say was a sham. It doesn't matter. Article 64 of the Russian Constitution certifies it as the law of the land for Russia. And from the Russian perspective, that's all that counts. And when Russia's winning the war, it's all that counts. Ukraine wants it all back. Ukraine, in order to sit down at the negotiating table, is demanding that Russia not only return all the territory, but return Crimea, which was annexed in 2014, pay reparations. The cost we're talking about right now is between $350 and $1 trillion of damage that has been done to Ukraine because of this war. And then turn over their political and military leadership to an international tribunal to be tried as war criminals. So now put on your Russian hat for a second. You're winning the war. You're going to win the war. Are you ever going to agree to this? And the answer is no. It's unrealistic. It's a non-starter. So why would the Ukrainians continue to put these terms on the table, knowing that the Russians are going to reject it, knowing that the war will continue, knowing that they're going to lose hundreds of thousands more people, potentially another 40, I'll answer questions in a minute, ma'am, another 40% of their territory. Because by the time this war ends, there's a good chance that Russia is going to take over Odessa, take over Nikolaev, Dnipropetrovsk, Kharkov, maybe even Sumy. These are all provinces of Ukraine where there is a heavy ethnic Russian presence. This war is not going to end on Ukrainian terms. It's going to end on Russian terms. So how do we get Russia to the table? Well, let's just start with the following. Angela Merkel gave an interview last week. I don't know, did anybody see it in the Der Spiegel magazine? Interesting interview, sort of a reflection on her time as the Chancellor of Germany. But she made an interesting observation in there. She said, you know, when NATO reached out to Ukraine in 2008 and invited them into NATO, I was against it at the time. I was against it. I said, it's not the right time. And then she said, it was like 1938. and the Prime Minister of United Kingdom, Chamberlain. You remember? Well, do you remember? Of course, none of us remember. We have to go to the history books. But Munich, the Munich Agreement, where Chamberlain went and met with Hitler in Munich and talked about Czechoslovakia and the whole idea. And the idea Chamberlain said is, I'm buying time, you see. We're not ready to take on Nazi Germany. I'm buying time for us to get ready to take on Nazi Germany. That's what this Munich Agreement was about. So Angela Merkel's putting herself as Chamberlain. I'm buying time, she said. I'm buying time for Ukraine to do what? To get their economy and their military in shape. To do what? To resist Russia. Why would they need to resist Russia if you're looking for a peaceful outcome? Because she tied it in with the Minsk Accords, 2014, 2015. Quick update on what Minsk is. In 2014, February 2014, there was a coup or a revolution, depending on your point of view, in Kiev, in Maidan Square. It was a violent revolution or coup that ousted Viktor Yanukovych, who was the constitutionally elected president of Ukraine. I'm not sitting here saying he was the democratic, wonderful, leader who believed in free press, and I'm not saying that. I'm saying he was the constitutionally elected president of Ukraine. And he was ousted in unconstitutional means, a violent coup d'etat carried out by ultra-nationalistic right-wing organization. Ma'am, I'm going to take questions at the end. So is that okay?
Yeah, you're saying a lot of things, but I'd like to contend with.
I know you would. I see your shirt, and I know you're going to, but you're going to give him plenty of opportunity to contend with it.
Okay.
Because if I disrupt this, then I lose my flow, and I'm an old guy, and I'll go off on a track. I'll start talking about puppies and kittens. So let me finish, and then I promise you, you'll get to ask your questions, and I'll deal with them as best I can. I promise. But now, where was I? Minsk. So, well, I was talking about Merkel, but she was saying that Minsk was a big deal too because it was buying time. Minsk wasn't designed to buy time. Minsk was a negotiated settlement that was designed to have a ceasefire, designed to end a conflict so that the Donbass would still be part of Ukraine, but B, respect the autonomous desires of the ethnic Russian majority population. You see, after that coup, the ultranationalists came in, right-wing, C-19, Sloboda Party. Later, they turned into something called the Azov Battalion. Now, some people take objection. They say that's a minority group, don't worry about it. U.S. Congress from 2015 to 2022 put a paragraph on the Defense Appropriations Act that said no U.S. taxpayer money can be used to train members of the Azov Battalion. Why? Because they're a white supremacist neo-Nazi group. So it's not Scott Ritter that's saying this, it's the United States Congress that said that. In 2019, the United States Congress sent a letter to the Secretary of State saying, why haven't you put the Azov Battalion on the foreign terrorist organization list? Because they are a despicable white supremacist neo-Nazi movement, hate movement. Why aren't you doing this? Which is a fair question because we never did put them on the foreign terrorist organization roster. Why? Because we were supporting them. I mean, we can go into a quick history lesson about the CIA's relationship with Stepan Bandera's Organization of National Unity and how we funded them from 1945 to 1954 to carry out a covert war against the Soviets and the Polish government, and how that failed, but then we continued to fund them from 1954 to 1990 for political movement to raise up against how they were part of the Gehlen organization, the former intelligence organization of Nazi Germany, that they were affiliated with that. The Gehlen organization was absorbed into the CIA in 1945, even though they were Nazis who deserved to be put on the Nuremberg Tribunal, hung by the neck until dead, but instead we made them part of our team and we used them to undermine the Soviets. We could get all into that. We could talk about the direct link between Stepan Bandera and the Azov Battalion, Stepan Bandera and Sloboda, Stepan Bandera, C-19 Stepan Bandera, who today the Ukrainian parliament has made the national hero of Ukraine. They have a street in Kiev called Stepan Bandera Avenue. And that is about as disgusting as having a street in New York City called Adolf Hitler Avenue. Stepan Bandera and his organization are responsible for the deaths of 40, 50, 60,000 Jews, 30,000 at Babi Yar, in Kiev, 110,000 Poles in Volyn. Let me tell you how they killed the Poles. They would go to the villages and surround it. They'd take the women and children, the old men, put them in a barn, set it on fire, and then shout, Slava Ukraina, as they burned to death. Stepan Bandera, who's worshipped today in Ukraine as the national hero. We could talk about that, but we won't. We'll move on to talk about other things, like Minsk and Angela Merkel, who said she viewed Minsk as buying the Ukrainian government 8 years to build up their military. For what purpose? Minsk was supposed to be a ceasefire agreement to stop a conflict. Angela Merkel saying she viewed Minsk as a sham, a lie, to buy time to build up the Ukrainian military to do what? What was the Ukrainian military going to do? Well, we know that in 2015, the United States built a training base in West Ukraine for the purpose of every 55 days training a Ukrainian army battalion to NATO standards before they were deployed to Eastern Ukraine to do what? Kill Russians. That's not me saying this. They brag about it. They made a slide, one of those famous Department of Defense PowerPoint presentations. They say, we train a new battalion every 55 days here before it goes over here. Now, again, I'm just a simple Marine. My math isn't that good. But if you begin training people in 2015 and you train them up until 2022, and every 55 days you're training a battalion, that's a lot of battalions, ladies and gentlemen. That's a lot of battalions that we train for what purpose? Because during this period of time, everybody's supposed to be implementing the Minsk Accords. The pressure is supposed to be put on the Ukrainian government, who signed the original documents. Petro Poroshenko, 2015, signed it, said, I will do this. Poroshenko is now saying it was all a lie. We were never going to implement Minsk. I was buying time to build my army to NATO standards to do what? There's the magic question. Build the army to do what? And the answer was to solve the problem of the Donbass and Crimea through military force of arms. The solution all along, disguised as peace, was war. And it wasn't Russia making that decision. Okay, ma'am, again, when I finish, you get to say what you need to say. I promise you, I really do. But it wasn't Russia that made that decision. It was the Ukrainian government. Petro Poroshenko, the president of Ukraine, stood up and bragged on TV. Ukrainian children, he said, will go to school, walk to school, breathe the free air. The children of the Donbass will cower in the basement because we're going to shell them. And they did shell them for 8 years, killing thousands. This is before February 24th, 2022. There was a war in the Donbass for 8 years. A war that began when a coup d'etat took place in February 2014, replacing the constitutionally mandated government, the legal government of Viktor Yanukovych, with a government handpicked by the United States. Again, Scott, are you making this up? No. You see, Victoria Nuland, who was one of these big Department of State people, had her phone conversation intercepted with the American ambassador before Yanukovych left, where she talks about my boy Yatsenko. See, she handpicked who was going to be the future government of Ukraine. They already determined that they're going to get rid of Yanukovych, replace him with an American-appointed government, not through constitutional means, but through a violent coup d'etat. And when they did that, after they did that, the violence began. You see, these right-wingers, they're a minority. Anybody knows that you check out the demographics of Ukrainian elections, you'll see that Sloboda, the right sector, is others, they get single digits in the vote, maybe 8%, 9%. They're not majority, but they brag about that. They say, we know we're a minority, but we dominate Ukrainian government through violence and the threat of violence. Both Poroshenko and Zelensky were told on the record, the right sector brags about this, that if you implement Minsk, we will hang you by the neck until dead on the streets of Kiev. I'm not making this up. They brag about it. They make videos about this. They say, this is what we're going to do to you if you implement Minsk. Wow. These guys who believe in violence, they came down to Odessa in April and May. And in Odessa, there was the Russian, ethnic Russian majority population of Odessa rose up against the nationalists. There was a riot in the streets. And the Kharkov men's soccer team, later on became the Azov Battalion, jammed 150 ethnic Russians into a trade union building and set it on fire and cheered as 48 of them died. Cheered as the people came out of the upper floors begging for help, laughed as they jumped out of the building, hit the ground. Sometimes when they survived, they shot them or beat them to death. And then these people turned their sights on the ethnic Russian population of the Donbass. The assault on Mariupol should go down in history as one of the most brutal assaults against a civilian population ever. It's fully documented. The rape, the murder, the torture of ethnic Russians by these fanatic, white supremacist, ultranationalist neo-Nazis, Stepan Bandera worshipers, went down on record. And so the ethnic Russians rose up and said, no, we don't want to be a part of this. And they started fighting. The Russian government stepped in and started helping them. You want to know why there was a Minsk II? Because Russia was kicking the crap out of the Ukrainian army. And the Ukrainians went, if we continue to fight, we're going to die. So they begged Angela Merkel and Sarkozy, I think was the French prime minister, to come in or president, to come in and negotiate a ceasefire. And they did. Putin didn't want to do it because he's winning. He's winning. My troops are beating them on the ground. We're going to resolve this Donbass thing. But no, he was told, take the peaceful off-ramp. Choose peace. And Putin went, I will choose peace. I will trust the international community that you're serious when you say you want to implement the Minsk Accords, which have a ceasefire, recognize the territorial integrity of Ukraine by ensuring that the Donbass did not succeed, but retained part of Ukraine, but created a sense of autonomy for the ethnic Russians to protect their language, their culture, their religion. You guys know that the Ukrainians call the Russian orcs, right? You know that. You know that the Western Ukrainian ultranationalists view the Russians as subhumans, that Stepan Bandera views them as subhumans. That's why he slaughters Russians like he slaughtered the Poles, like he slaughtered the Jews. The Russians weren't willing to live under that oppression. So they said, Putin said, well, we have to protect that population. So Minsk Accord was supposed to do that. What needed to happen were constitutional changes in the Ukrainian constitution that would provide autonomy for the ethnic Russians of the Donbass, in exchange for which there would be a ceasefire and the international borders would be recognized as Ukrainian controlled. It's right there in writing. I'm not making anything up. And the Ukrainian government refused to sign it. Why? Because it was never about peace, ladies and gentlemen. It was about buying time to build up the Ukrainian army. For what purpose? To invade the Donbass, to evict the Russians from the Donbass, to invade Crimea, and to evict the Russians from Crimea. Now, people might say they have every right to do that because the Donbass, of course, is Ukraine, Crimea is Ukraine. They do it. Yeah, but guys, Minsk, that wasn't what Minsk was about. Minsk was a peace agreement, a ceasefire agreement, and Ukrainians lied, but it wasn't just the Ukrainians that lied. Angela Merkel admits that she lied. She was one of the negotiators. She brags about how she flew here, there, everywhere, brought everybody under the same roof. Oh my God, it was the hardest couple days of my life, but I finally got the agreement. I got the agreement, but the agreement wasn't for peace. The agreement was to buy time for a future war. Petro Poroshenko acknowledges this. Vladimir Putin just had a meeting with Russian moms and wives of soldiers. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say that this was a straight up legitimate meeting. We know it's not. These were handpicked mothers, handpicked wives. This was a political meeting. It was done for a purpose because Vladimir Putin had something to say. One of the things he said, and this is what's pertinent to this conversation. He said, I made a mistake. The mistake I made was in 2014 and 15, believing the West when they said they wanted peace, and believing Merkel, Sarkozy, and the others when they said they were pursuing a ceasefire. He said, I should have fought the war then and finished it then, and then none of this would be happening today. That was my mistake. The reason why I bring that up is not to say that Vladimir Putin's right. I'm bringing it up to say that's what's in Vladimir Putin's mind. So when the West today is talking about negotiations and saying they want a negotiated settlement here, Vladimir Putin's never going to believe the West again. Why would he? Why would he believe the West? They acknowledge they lied. He is at war with Ukraine. Russia is at war with Ukraine. This war has gone beyond simply resolving the question of the Donbass and Crimea. This war is now an existential struggle between Russia and the collective West. The Ukrainian army died on the battlefield in June and July of this year. You say, wait a minute, Scott, they can't. They're still fighting. The army that's fighting Ukraine today is not a Ukrainian army. It's a NATO army, trained, equipped, oftentimes manned by non-Ukrainian forces. Ask any Russian commander what's going on in the Donetsk and Lugansk. You know, the way this war works, again, you have to understand, during the 8 years of the non-war war that was fought in the Donbass, there was regular radio communication between the militias of the Donbass and Lugansk and Ukrainian forces. They're calling each other up, making fun of each other, yelling at each other, doing this, that, and the other thing. But they learned to talk about this. They learned to listen to their voices. Today, the Russians are listening. They say, there ain't no Ukrainian voices over there. We're hearing English, French, and Polish. That's it. Very few Ukrainian voices. Ask the Poles how many caskets returned last month of October alone. 1,000. 1,000 Polish military men lost their lives fighting in Ukraine. There's tens of thousands of Poles fighting in Ukraine as we speak. There's tens of thousands of foreign mercenaries fighting in Ukraine as we speak. They're fighting using NATO-provided equipment. They were trained by NATO. They have NATO communications. They have NATO intelligence. They have NATO planning. It's a NATO army fighting a NATO war against Russia. And Russia is going to win, which means now, what does victory look like for Russia? It doesn't look like simply being satisfied with the Donbass or Crimea anymore. It looks like destroying the Ukrainian army. That's called demilitarization. That's one of the stated objectives of the special military operation. And denazification, which means eliminating the hateful ideology of Stepan Bandera once and for all. I don't know how you do that, ladies and gentlemen. I'm not going to sit here and say there's a magic solution, because how do you get a thought out of people's heads, especially one that they've linked to the very essence of who they are? So I think that might be a mission impossible, but it means that a lot of people are going to suffer as Russia tries to accomplish that task. Peace in Ukraine is ugly, no matter how you carve this up. The question now is, how do we prevent the horrendous loss of life that's going to be occurring? Is there a chance for peace? And right now I have to unfortunately say no, there is not a chance for peace. Because in order for there to be peace, in order for there to be a negotiation, both sides have to come to the table confident that the other one will do that which they proclaim to do. You know, Russia, this is a fact that many people have overlooked. On April 1st of this year, Russia met with Ukraine in Istanbul, where Russia was prepared to end the war. The terms of ending this conflict were that the Donbass, Lugansk and Donetsk, would be independent, and that Crimea would be Russia, but everything else is Ukraine. And the Ukrainians were ready to sign that deal. They sent a negotiating team to Istanbul, and they were ready to conclude that deal. Then Boris Johnson flew into Kiev and met with President Zelensky and said, "You will not sign that deal, because we want to inject tens of billions of dollars of weapons and financial assistance to keep this war going." You see, that's the critical moment right there, when it stopped being a Russian-Ukrainian conflict. Because had it been a Russian-Ukrainian conflict, this conflict would have ended on April 1st. It became a Russian-NATO conflict where NATO used Ukraine as a proxy to achieve Western objectives. What are Western objectives with Russia? Because this is a very important thing when we talk about how do we resolve this issue peacefully. You can't start looking at the West's objective with Russia beginning on February 24th 2022 when this current conflict started. You have to actually go back to 1990. Why 1990, Scott? That's a long time ago. I don't know. That's like when 1989, the Berlin Wall came down. 1990s, at the end, near the end of the Cold War. Berlin Wall comes down. Germany was occupied that time, split in half. West Germany, East Germany. East Germany had 400,000 Soviet troops occupying it. Why were they occupying it? Because Germany used to be known as Nazi Germany. They fought a war called World War II, and they were defeated by a coalition of nations, including the Soviet Union, the United States, Great Britain, France, Canada, and others, who beat them. And as a result of losing that conflict, Germany got split up. Let me tell you what else happened when Germany lost that conflict. They lost a lot of territory. A lot of territory was turned over to Poland to make up for other territory that constitutes today what is Western Ukraine. They lost some territory claims in France. When you lose wars, you lose territory, ladies and gentlemen. That's just a simple fact. And the reason why I bring that up is Ukraine is losing this war, and they're going to lose territory. Anybody says you can say that that's wrong, I'm not going to debate you. But don't say it's without historical precedent. When you lose wars, you don't get to dictate the outcome. The outcome gets dictated to you. That's just a statement of fact. But Germany was divided into two, occupied. The Cold War ends, and the West is saying, we want to unify Germany. But you can't unify Germany unless a couple things happen. One, there has to be a peace treaty. Wait a minute, Scott, 1990, 1945. You're telling me from 1945 to 1990 there wasn't a peace treaty ending the war between Germany and the Soviet Union? The answer is no, there wasn't. Why? Because the West didn't want it. We preferred to keep the conflict going because we were at a Cold War with the Soviet Union where we leveraged that to keep the Soviet Union down through sanctions, by pinning them in through alliances. It wasn't just NATO. There was something called CENTO. Do people remember CENTO, the Central Treaty Organization? Turkey, Iran, Iraq, Pakistan. CENTO. CETO, the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. It was a ring of treaties designed to strangle the Soviet Union during the Cold War. So now the Soviets are saying, we need a peace treaty. They're saying, well, we'll give it to you, but what about your troops? Well, we'll evacuate our troops, but we need a promise, and this is the big one. We need you to promise that if we leave East Germany and you unify Germany, that NATO will not expand into East Germany, that NATO stays where NATO is, that NATO will not take advantage of this situation. They were told over and over again, you have our word. James Baker, not 1 inch eastward. That is a direct quote. Not 1 inch eastward. NATO will not expand 1 inch eastward. Gorbachev pulled the 400,000 troops out. Germany was reunified, had their peace treaty. Yay, yay, victory. 1992, Cold War ends, and NATO starts expanding. More than 1 inch eastward, ladies and gentlemen. They expanded hundreds of kilometers eastward. They absorbed virtually all of the former Warsaw Pact nations. They absorbed the 3 Baltic republics. And in 2008, they sought to absorb Ukraine and Georgia, former Soviet republics. Why should Russia be threatened by this? Because if Russia isn't a threat, NATO's expansion shouldn't be a threat to Russia. Why would Russia view this as a threat? Well, the answer is because NATO needed Russia as justification for the expansion. Russia tried over and over again to make peace with Europe. In the 1990s, Boris Yeltsin bent over backwards to have good relations with NATO. But what happened in the 1990s? If you're familiar with Russian history, you know the 1990s are one of the worst decades in Russian history. The collapse of the Soviet Union left a Russian nation that had no economy, no politics, nothing. It was horrific. Pensioners lost their pensions. People didn't have jobs. The raw materials were being sucked out of the nation. Nobody made money except a handful of oligarchs who stole blind from the Russian people, building up these empires, these economic empires. That was in the 1990s. Boris Yeltsin was the president. Was he a democratically elected president? Maybe early on, but democracy doesn't put tanks in the streets of the capital city to fire rounds into the parliament when the parliament disagrees with the president. That's what Boris Yeltsin did in October of 1993. Brought the Russian army out, fired tank rounds, set the parliament on fire, and killed scores of Russian parliamentarians who didn't agree with his vision of Russian democracy. October 1993. You know how in 2016, here in America, we like to complain about how the Russians stole an election for Donald Trump? Well, we now know that that was false. I'm not here singing praises of Donald Trump, don't get me wrong, but we know that it was false. We know that Christopher Steele's dossier was manufactured. We know that the hack of the Democratic National Committee didn't happen the way they said it happened. It's fact. But you know what did happen in 1996? We stole a Russian election. There was a guy, the head of the Communist Party, who was running. He was going to beat Vladimir Putin, Boris Yeltsin, in a stand-up election. We couldn't have that. Couldn't let the communists come back into power into Russia. So we went in and stole an election, and we bragged about it. Time magazine has a front page, the best election money can buy. The United States stole an election in Russia. We bragged about it. We said, this is what needs to happen. This is democracy, baby. Democracy. Russia was a mess. Yeltsin was corrupt. The oligarchs were destroying this nation. And then in 1999, something happened. Yeltsin resigned, and he appointed somebody to replace him, a guy named Vladimir Putin, the accidental president. Man shouldn't have been president. Well, he wasn't part of the insiders. He was a former low-level KGB officer, went to be a taxi driver in Ukraine, ended up working on the administration of Sobchak, the mayor of not Ukraine, I'm sorry, St. Petersburg, worked in the offices of Sobchak, came over to Moscow. And you know what happens when you have a sea of corruption and somebody who's uncorruptible arrives? They start to rise to the top. I know, I hear a wow, he disagrees with me. That's okay, we can talk about that later on. Vladimir Putin was not part of the family, the Yeltsin family. Vladimir Putin was not part of the oligarchs. You know, when Yeltsin was his health was declining, the family and the oligarchs were like wolves around this dying corpse, waiting for it to go away so they could jump in and rip it apart even more. And you know what was encouraging that? America, Great Britain, all the other friends of Russia. Why? We don't want Russia ever to rise up and replicate the power that the Soviet Union had. The policy of the United States has been, since the end of the Cold War, to keep Russia down permanently. And that's why we encouraged the decade of the 1990s. Think about that. We encouraged the decade of the 90s, which gutted Russia as a nation. Vladimir Putin takes over in 1999, has an election in early 2000. Nobody thought he was going to win that election. All the American experts are saying he can't win, he has no constituents. He won the election, he became the president. Why? Because he's not part of the family. He's not part of the system that Yeltsin put in place. He was something new, he was something different. You can sit here and say you don't like Vladimir Putin, and I'm not going to debate you. That is your prerogative. But if you're a student of history, you have to know this, that if it weren't for Vladimir Putin, the trajectory that Russia was on was a trajectory towards the death of a nation. Vladimir Putin reversed that trajectory. For better or for worse, for right or wrong, I'm just telling you a fact. If it weren't for Vladimir Putin, Russia wouldn't be what it is today. And I'll also tell you this, that if you're a Russian, when I was a weapons inspector in Vodkinsk, the town was collapsing because of defense industry, the peace, the effort to convert the defense industry into civilian, the general demise of the Soviet condition. In Vodkinsk, the city, which is a factory town like many cities in Russia are, that everything is run by the factory. The factory has the money, they pay the salaries for the schools, they pay the salaries for everybody. So when the factory doesn't do well, the town doesn't do well, and Russia went into general decay. And from, say, 1989 to 1999, Russia decayed. It was a nation in decay. If you go and take photographs from 1999 and you compare to today, you will see a completely different nation. A nation reborn. Again, I'm not sitting here singing the praises of Vladimir Putin. I'm not pretending he's Mr. Democracy. I'm only saying that from the Russian perspective, Vladimir Putin raised the country out of the graveyard and brought it up to a level that makes it competitive in the world today. And the reason why I bring that up is that's the exact opposite trajectory we, the United States, want out of Russia. We've been against Vladimir Putin from day one. We've been pushing to have him removed from power from the very beginning. George Bush invited him to the branch, looked in his eyes and said, I saw his soul. Well, I don't know what he saw, but he didn't see Vladimir Putin's soul. He saw Vladimir Putin looking around saying, yep, I got the measure of America. I know what needs to be done. In 2005, Vladimir Putin gave an address, April 2005, before the Federal Assembly. It's a well-quoted address, but it's always misquoted. What he said was that the fall of the Soviet Union was one of the greatest calamities in the 20th century. Now, it's been misquoted. People say he said it was the greatest calamity in the 20th century. And they're like, how could you compare the collapse of the Soviet Union with, Adolf Hitler's Holocaust and all this kind of stuff? Well, he wasn't trying to compare. He said it was one of the. But then the part that everybody misses, and this is the important part, because overnight, tens of millions of Russians became homeless. Under the Soviet Union, if you were Russian living in Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Ukraine, the Baltics, you were part of a nation. You had a national identity. You had a home. That home was linked to Moscow. At the fall of the Soviet Union, you're a Russian living in those places. You no longer have a link to Moscow. You're linked to the respective capitals, and they don't view you as one of them. If you're a Russian in Uzbekistan, you're not an Uzbek. That's how it works. And he said, we abandoned them. And I, as the Russian president, must care for the Russian nation and the Russian people. Now, I'm not sitting here saying that's the right thing. I'm saying that's what he said. So the mindset of Vladimir Putin is one that says, I must care for the Russian people. That's my duty and responsibility as the leader of the Russian nation. And the nation is beyond the territorial boundaries of the Russian Federation. The nation is a nation that is based upon ethnicity, religion, culture. If you're Russian Orthodox, if you speak the Russian language, if you're linked to Russia through history, that's the nation. So that's what's in Vladimir Putin's mind. I have to protect the nation. In 2007, he gave one of the greatest speeches in history. And I'm not saying because I believe everything he said. I said it's a great speech. It's an important speech. It's the address he gave at the Munich Security Conference, where he stood up in front of the entire West and lectured them on what they were doing to Russia and what they were doing to the world. He spoke for an hour, or less than an hour. But the best part of it was the question and answer afterwards, where he was asked questions by all these political and economic elites of the West. And then he answered, and you watched them twitch, watched them squirm, as he hits them with fact about the role that the West was playing. How dare the West lecture him, the president of Russia, when they invade Iraq? Remember, this is 2007. Iraq was on everybody's mind. People don't like to think about Iraq today. We forget all that when we start pointing fingers at Vladimir Putin in the violation of national integrity, sovereignty, etc. We invaded Iraq in 2003. We violated their sovereignty, and no one cares about that today. The hypocrisy that's built into the West. But that's okay. Putin did, and that's why he brought it up. Then in 2008, NATO invites Ukraine to join NATO. Why? Well, we have some insight. In 2019, RAND Corporation, a think tank affiliated with the power elites in Washington, published a paper on how we can go about destroying Russia. Literally, it's not the literal title, but that's what they meant. What can we do to tear Russia apart, to bring it down? And one of the key things they said is to strip Ukraine away from the Russian sphere of interest. Strip it away, bring it to the West, and Russia will collapse. That was the goal. It's been the goal from the very beginning. And of course, Putin knows this. That's why he said, we will not allow Ukraine to join NATO. In 2009, February 2009, then Ambassador of the United States to Russia, William Burns, wrote a memorandum called Niet means Niet, no means no. And what he said there is that when Russia says Ukraine is a red line, they mean it. They're not joking. They're not bluffing. So we need to be very careful what our next steps are. Because, and this is the important part, ladies and gentlemen, because if we continue this policy, Russia will invade and Ukraine will lose the Donbass and Crimea. February 2009, we knew exactly what the consequences of our actions were. We knew that if we continued to pursue a policy to bring NATO or Ukraine into NATO, that this would end in a war that had Russia invading Ukraine and stripping the Donbass and Crimea away. We knew this, and yet we continued to pursue this policy, ladies and gentlemen. That should disturb everybody here. See, the people who've been promoting war with Russia, a Russian-Ukrainian conflict, don't reside in Moscow. They don't even reside in Kiev. They reside in Washington, D.C. They reside in London. They reside in Berlin. They reside in Paris. They reside in Brussels and Strasbourg, in the power centers of the collective West that has been trying to destroy Russia ever since Russia became a federated nation in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union. That's why there's a war in Ukraine today. And that's why there will be no negotiated peace, because Russia is not going to negotiate with the people that have been trying to destroy them. You know, I wrote a book out there. It's called Disarmament in the Time of Perestroika. I think it's a fascinating book about the INF Treaty and arms control and the Soviet Union during that time and my experiences. But it's more than that. You see, if I told you, if I'd started out this saying, we live in difficult times. Russian troops and American troops are staring each other across the border, heavily armed. America's sanctioning Russia. Russia's avoiding the sanctions. And there's a threat of nuclear war. There was a nuclear exercise that almost spun out of control. And there was talks of using nuclear weapons. People say, yes, Scott, that's what happened the last couple of months. I said, no, I'm talking about the 1980s. See, 1980s, it was pretty bad. It was very bad. The INF Treaty, an arms control treaty to get rid of intermediate nuclear forces, that is, ballistic missiles with a range of 500 to 5,500 miles, saved the world from nuclear annihilation. Had we not gotten rid of those weapons, I'm here to tell you right now, we wouldn't be here today, because there is no such thing as a limited nuclear war. Those weapons would have been used, and after they were used, the world would end in a general nuclear exchange. That is just a statement of fact. Study the nuclear doctrine of either the Soviet Union at the time or the United States, and you will understand the moment one nuclear weapon is used, they all get used. And we got rid of those weapons. And in doing so, we started a process of working cooperatively with the Soviet Union to find the off-ramp away from nuclear annihilation and permanent confrontation to peaceful coexistence. You see, the INF Treaty is what I call a template of hope. A template of hope. And that's why I think it's important to read the book, because it shows that we can get out of this problem. Bad news, though. The Russians don't want to talk to us. See, on November 29th, the Russians and the Americans were supposed to meet in Cairo to discuss the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, to sit down and say, how can we get this treaty back on track? How can we begin the process of discussing responsible nuclear disarmament and maybe move in a direction where we can take down some of the weapons that are threatening European peace and security? The Russians withdrew. People say, of course they withdrew, those dirty Russians. They want to cause trouble. But what the Russians said is, how can you expect us to sit down at a table and negotiate with you at a time when your policy literally is to kill Russian soldiers in Ukraine? When your Secretary of Defense comes out and says, we're providing billions of dollars of support to the Ukrainian military for the sole purpose of bringing pain to the Russian military, we want to inflict harm on the Russian military, so much so that they will never again seek to do what they're doing in Ukraine. That is the stated policy of Lloyd Austin, Anthony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, and the rest of the Biden administration, to kill Russian soldiers. Think about it for a second, and now go back in history when we were back in Afghanistan. Do you remember the bounties, the Russian bounties? The big story, those dirty Russians were paying the Taliban bounties to kill Americans. And we were up in arms. It was fake. It never happened. It was one of these mainstream media garbage. But the point is, the mere thought that Russia would pay money to the Taliban to kill 1, 2, 3 Americans sickened us collectively. Ladies and gentlemen, the United States is paying $56 to $100 billion to the Ukrainians to kill thousands of Russians. And you expect the Russians to sit at the table with us? We are imposing sanctions on Russia. These sanctions aren't designed to hurt Putin, the oligarchs. No. These sanctions were specifically designed to cripple the Russian people, to deny them livelihood, to collapse their economy, so that their children couldn't go to school, couldn't have health care. There wouldn't be a future. That was the purpose of the sanctions. Now, it didn't happen because the Russians happen to be a little bit smarter about energy security, global energy security than the West. Here's a pro hint. If you're going to call a nation a gas station disguised as a country, that's sort of what the United States have been calling Russia for some time. They're just a gas station disguised as a country. Don't be a big American automobile on a superhighway in the middle of nowhere with an empty gas tank. Because that's what the Western economy is right now. It's stuck in the middle of nowhere in desperate need of the energy that Russia was providing, lacking it, prices are going up, German economy is collapsing, French economy is collapsing, the British economy, Europe is collapsing. You know who's not collapsing? Us. We're paying a little bit higher prices, but because we're the good friends of Europe, I mean, we are really good friends of Europe, we're their NATO allies, by the way. When we denied them access to cheap Russian gas, we volunteered to sell expensive American liquid natural gas. Now, as a good friend, we would say, you're going to get it at the same price you're paying for the Russians because we don't want to harm your economy. No, we're making them pay 10 to 20 times more. We're raking in the money, the profits. Not only that, we're destroying the German economy to the point that 1 out of every 4 industry jobs are going to come to the United States in the next year because they can't afford to stay in Germany. That's what it's like to be a friend of America. But the point is, the sanctions didn't work, but the intent of the sanctions was to hurt the Russian people. The Russians have said, we can't sit at a table with people who continue to try and kill our troops and make our people suffer through sanctions. That when you talk about trust but verify, we don't want to just talk about the verification procedures of an arms control agreement. We want to talk about the trust between nations. And right now, there is no trust between nations. Russia will never trust the West again. So if you want to talk about a peaceful resolution, if you're truly anti-war, the fundamental question is how can the West regain the trust of Russia? And it is incumbent upon the West to do it, not on Russia. Russia doesn't need to gain the trust of the West. It's not Russia that has betrayed the West. It's the West that betrayed Russia. So now we come down to the final point. How do we get out of this war? And the sad fact is we don't, ladies and gentlemen, because there's no one right now in Washington, D.C. who's thinking about how do we reestablish trust with Russia. Russia is fully committed to winning this war. 10 to 15 division equivalents are arriving on the battlefield in the next month. And once they arrive there, they're going to begin the process of destroying the Ukrainian army. Now we come back to what I started. Destroying the Ukrainian army sounds pretty copacetic, doesn't it? It means they're going to fire artillery rounds into their gut men. They're going to have their guts split open, leaning on the ground, and they're going to suffer for hours while they bleed out, get infected, and die. That's war. They're going to shoot people. Sometimes you die instantly, sometimes you don't. They're going to use thermobaric weapons which are going to suck the lungs out of people. That's war, ladies and gentlemen. That's what's going to happen over the course of the next weeks and months. Hundreds of thousands of people are going to die because we can't find a way to negotiate with the Russians. Thank you very much. I'll take any questions anybody has. Sure.
I think you might have already answered my question. That's a softball question. You were on the Duran with Alexander McCoolus, I think, sometime in February, March.
Mhm.
That you said this war is going to be over in 2 weeks.
Yep.
I don't mean to get you. I mean,
No.
I listened to you. I appreciate those things you said.
It's a fair question.
And it seems like you were wrong.
Yep.
I think you indicated that Boris Johnson had a play in that. You want to expand on it?
Sure.
Can you also repeat the question?
Yep, I'll repeat the question. Is there a possibility to get some water? Yeah, because my throat is going to literally dry up in about 3 seconds. But I'm going to answer your question. See the sacrifice I'm willing to make for your question. Yeah. Look, when this concept of this war started, almost any military professional would take a look at a couple of things. Number one of which is Russian military doctrine and the way Russians fight doctrinal war. And the overwhelming firepower that Russia brings to the table and the way, the methodologies that they should employ by doctrine. And I've studied Russian doctrine inside and out. Told me that the Russians were going to steamroll over the Ukrainians and win this war. And it wasn't just me. The director of the CIA briefed Joe Biden the same thing. The director of the CIA said this war will be over in a week. Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, 4 stars, testified before the United States Congress and said Kiev will fall in 72 hours. So it wasn't just Scott Ritter that got it wrong. Everybody got it wrong. Thank you very much. You know who didn't get it right, or know who got it right? No one. No one. You want to know why? Because Russia didn't go to war. Yes, they did, Scott. They sent tanks. No, Russia carried out what's called a special military operation. Now, here's where we get into some controversy. Because if you're Ukrainian, you don't view it as a special military operation. If you're Ukrainian, you view it as a Russian invasion of Ukraine. But the mindset of the Russians was completely different. The Russians have a historical view that the Ukrainians and the Russians are Slavic brothers. This historical view is linked to the experience of the Soviet Union. To give you an example, every senior Ukrainian officer of the rank of colonel or above was trained in a Soviet military academy where he studied alongside the Russian officers, colonel and above, who are currently fighting for the Russians. These are guys that know each other. They married their sisters, their daughters, their wives. You scratch a Russian, you get a Ukrainian. You scratch a Ukrainian, you get a Russian. And so the Russian perspective was they're not going to steamroll Ukraine because they don't want to go to war against Ukraine. See, when I went to war against Iraq, I had no problem steamrolling the Iraqis. Why? I didn't feel a sense of brotherhood with the Iraqis. They were the enemy, and I was going to kill the enemy in as large of numbers as possible because that's what war is about. Russia did not go to war against Ukraine. Russia came in using tactics that were totally deviated from their doctrine. They didn't protect left flank, right flank. They didn't provide rear security. They just went straight in to absorb territory because they worked under the assumption that the Ukrainian military would stay in barracks and that the civilian leadership would open the doors and not resist. Why did they work on that assumption? Because the 5th Directorate of the FSB, that's the Russian internal security people responsible for the near abroad, which includes Ukraine, had briefed the Russian leadership that they had won over a lot of people. They had bought off the loyalty of Ukrainian generals, Ukrainian leaders. In some places it worked. Look at the rapid advance in Kherson and Zaporizhia. Russian troops went out of Crimea and rapidly captured some territory. Other places it didn't work. When they came out of Sumy, they came down, they were ambushed. They suffered heavy casualties. Heavy casualties. They got it wrong. The Russians got it wrong. We got it wrong because we assumed they'd be doctrinal. But here's the second part of getting it wrong. You see, the Russians had to adapt. And it takes time. When you put 200,000 troops in motion, you can't just, it's not like a computer game and you reset. Reset, start over. No, it's in motion. You've committed to a plan that's attached to logistics, the whole thing. They had to gradually transition into a new phase. And the new phase was, they transitioned sometime in the middle of March. And it was supposed to be a focus on the Donbass, to stop making a move against Kiev, stop all this other stuff, focus on the Donbass. On March 25th, they announced it, phase 2. And they also said, we're going to withdraw from the Kiev area, northern Ukraine area, withdraw out of there as a good faith measure in anticipation of what? The Istanbul round of peace negotiations that was supposed to bring an end to the conflict. But the problem is, those same geniuses who said Russia's going to steamroll into Ukraine now took a look at what Russia was doing and said, Russia's weak. They ain't that good. They didn't steamroll. Not only that, they're retreating. We got them on the run. Ukraine, no peace deal, Ukraine, no peace deal. We can beat the Russians now because they're weak. They can't fight. We're going to give the Ukrainians tens of billions of dollars. New Lend-Lease Act, $43 billion, May 2022. Huh? The whole purpose of that, according to Lloyd Austin, was to bleed Russia white, to kill Russian soldiers because we got them on the run now. We got them on the run. They can't fight. That's the American attitude. Lloyd Austin, direct quote. Antony Blinken, direct quote. U.S. policy. They were wrong. See, Russia wasn't on the run. Russia had made a mistake. They were adapting. They were seeking a peaceful outcome, the 1 April settlement that would resolve the Donbass issue and the Crimea issue. But when the Ukrainians left the peace table, Russia said, oh, now we're at war. Not just against Ukraine, though. Now we're at war against NATO. It's providing tens of billions of dollars of equipment, etc. And that war changed. Now, it took Russia a little bit of time to adapt. You just don't change overnight. And we saw the Ukrainian, when those troops, remember the Duran? I was on the Duran. Well, I was on a later version. And I said something like, Gosh, the provision of tens of billions of dollars of military equipment to Ukraine is a game changer. Remember that word? I got heavily attacked for that. Game changer. What do you mean, Scott? You were saying the Russians are winning. Now you're saying it's a game changer. I said, man, when you pour in $50 billion worth of equipment, it changes the game. It doesn't mean the outcome's different. It just means that this conflict stopped being between Russia and Ukraine, started being between Russia and NATO. A game changer. And Russia responded by mobilizing 300,000 troops. Another game changer. And that's where we are today. A war between Russia and the collective West, where Russia's burn rate is lower than that of the collective West, and the replenishment rate is higher, just like I talked about earlier. Did I answer your question? Okay. Yes, ma'am. I promise.
You mentioned the burn rate earlier too, and I think you might want to, clarify it. It's not the same concept. Like I've been reading and hearing reports that in the last couple of weeks, Russians have been dying at the rate of 200, 300, 400 a day. That the new conscripts are coming, they're not trained, they don't even have good weapons, and the Ukrainians are mowing them down with artillery. So, this is the reports that I've been.
Yep.
And it's not me, I really believe. Yeah, so I would be careful and be more nuanced about reporting such that this is not uniformly across the board that Russia has a lower burn rate and higher replacement. In fact, they're running out of a lot of weapons and resorting to the old weapons and then basic. So I think I beg to differ with your
No, I respect that.
characterization.
I respect where you're coming from, but let me tell you about where I come from. Okay, I have a career as a professional military intelligence officer. I briefed the President of the United States, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Secretary General, on down. In all of my briefings, I was 100% accurate. Why? Because I'm an unbiased intelligence officer who looks at the facts. I'm an expert at discerning things. Now, you talk about artillery. Here's the problem with artillery. I'm an old artillery officer, too. I used to do it for a living. So I have a little bit of understanding how these things work. The Ukrainians basically are operating at anywhere from an 8 to 10 disadvantage in artillery. That means for every single Ukrainian tube, there's 8 to 10 Russian tubes firing in response. You disagree with that assessment? The Ukrainians agree with it. It comes from the Ukrainian General Staff. I know, I'm just telling you, Ukrainian, this is a Ukrainian figure. So I'm going to run with the Ukrainian data right now. So now you have a tube of artillery. And let's say you have a highly trained team, and they're bam, round down range. Good job, guys. Boom, you got the Russians. Bam, 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 bam. 10 coming back at you. Who's going to win this duel? Russia every single time. So when people come up to start to tell me the Ukrainians have a burn rate of Russians higher than the Ukraine, I'm sitting there going, it can't happen. It's mathematically impossible to happen.
I would just say that there's been different battles, different theaters, and in Kharkiv, they left a lot of equipment on the field and they ran. And Ukraine actually got a lot of tanks and other
Yeah, I know.
vehicles and weapons,
Yeah.
munitions
Yeah.
from that. So
Yeah.
they have run, I think you're making really strong, convincing arguments, but you're overstating.
I'm not overstating my case, ma'am. When you lose 20,000 people taking Kharkov, that's a Ukrainian number, not a Russian number. And the Russians lose 300. How am I overstating my case? Where have I overstated it?
Because you're not admitting that Russia had a higher burn rate and they had.
Russia's never had a higher burn rate. Even early on in the war, they didn't have a higher burn rate.
So, okay, they have a lot of artillery.
Pardon? I can't hear you.
They don't have 100,000 dead?
No, they don't. They have 80,000 casualties. 80,000 casualties. That was as of October. Since October, Russia's probably suffered another 3,000 to 5,000 casualties. So we're probably looking anywhere between 85, let's say max 90,000 casualties, not dead, casualties. The number of dead that Russia has suffered is anywhere between 6,000 and 9,000 regular troops. Then you take the Donetsk and Lugansk militias and add another 15,000. You throw in Wagner and you throw in some of the volunteer units, you can take that up. We're probably looking at an area of 20,000 dead Russians, maybe a little bit more. 80,000 total casualties. That's a lot.
Russian sources?
Huh?
Where did you get those from Russian sources? Right? You didn't pull it out
I don't pull anything out of air.
Okay, where?
Russia.
Okay, one of your Russian sources?
About 8 of my Russian sources, but that's okay.
Okay,
I don't work with one source.
I accept that.
Well, I do too, because I double check it. I actually go back and look at the battles that were fought. I lay out, I do a force disposition. It used to be my job, man. So I love doing that. I love taking a map and putting the forces out there, looking at the terrain, looking at the equipment, figuring out fire rates, burn rates, training, etc. And then I take a look at the news reports and I realize that everything the Ukrainians say is fiction. The fictional victories of the Ukrainian military. You don't win a battle taking terrain when you litter the battlefield with the bodies of your dead soldiers. That's not a victory. Or if it is, it's a Pyrrhic victory, going back to ancient Greece, King Pyrrhus, and the victories he won against the Romans, but he lost men that couldn't be replaced, so he lost the war. Ukraine has lost men they can't replace. How many men are in the NATO training pipeline right now in Ukraine? I already told you, 40,000.
I don't know all these facts, but I do know some things, and I know that Russia has bought incinerators and
No, you did. You don't. No, you don't.
I read that.
I know you read it, but did you?
Well, how do you know it's not true?
Because I looked at the incinerator in question. It has a serial number on it. I traced the serial number to the factory that produces it, and it's a trash incinerator. It ain't a body incinerator. It's just fiction. I'm just being honest with you.
Everything that Ukraine says this and everything that Russia says true.
Not everything, but most. Yeah. It is an interesting perspective. But I tell you what, come and talk to me in 6 months. All right? Go talk to the wives, the mothers, the daughters of the dead Ukrainian soldiers, the 320,000 who signed a petition to the Ukrainian government asking to find out what happened to their husbands. That's 320,000 signatures. What happened to their husbands? I'm not making it up. It's a fair question. They're missing. Why are they missing? Why aren't the Ukrainians being honest about their death? If you ask that question, do you know how the Ukrainians are paid? Who's paying the Ukrainian military? We are, the American taxpayer. We provide a lump sum of money to the Ukrainian government, and then they send it out to the various commanders who are supposed to pay the soldiers. What happens if a soldier dies and you report the death? You have to pay death benefits to the family. But if you're part of the most corrupt nation in Europe, instead of not reporting the number, you put the money in your pocket, off it goes to an offshore account, and that's what's going on. And the second the United States Congress starts asking questions about what happened to the tens of billions of dollars that we've provided to Ukrainians, this will all be out there for the public to see.
Have you taken into account?
Not too many questions. You're not the only one here. I'm sorry. You're too long.
Scott, I'm sorry. To your whole speech today, as I will listen, maybe I want to a little bit clear up your situation. A lot of people right now maybe leaving this place, they still under the question, why such a Putin desperate guy stopped going with such a operation to to Ukraine. Maybe a little bit, I know, I've been following you, with talking, I see what you bring up to the media. My question is, maybe you will open up a little bit for us here, if you're familiar with the story, I believe you are, and for somebody who are completely clueless about why exactly Putin went for special, the special
Military operation.
to Ukraine. What was there specifically? We're talking about kids, we're talking about specific laboratories. I'm not talking about Nazis. Nazi is going to be all over. I mean, this right now coming out, on the right and left. What about the kids? What about the trafficking the kids? They have been saying, from what I did hear many months ago, from sources that you've been, maybe kind of communicating to. They've been saying the traffic in Ukraine was the largest in the world, right? You have something.
What I'll say this about trafficking. Yeah, the question is, what is the real motive behind Vladimir Putin's initiating a special military operation? The story behind the story. And you brought up some instances. You talk about the trafficking of children. It's more than that. It's trafficking of women. It's trafficking of human beings. Ukraine is one of the most corrupt nations on the earth. It's also one of the most poverty-stricken nations on the earth. There's a lot of people who are suffering because of an economy that doesn't function, and they get sucked into the bowels of Europe. These are women who get sent from Ukraine. They go to Hungary. They become prostitutes to service American servicemen who are operating in Bosnia and elsewhere, NATO servicemen, or men in general. That's there. from my opinion, Putin didn't go to war because of that. That's just an unfortunate reality. Putin's talked about it, people talk, but that's not a justification to go to war. Russia is a very legally minded country. I know I hear the snickers, but they are. I've worked with them, I've dealt with their foreign ministry, and I know that you don't do anything unless in accordance with the rule of law, you cross the T's, you dot the I's. Russia went to war in Ukraine, citing Article 51 of the United Nations Charter, specifically self-defense, and then they had a modification of that, which is preemptive self-defense of a collective security arrangement. That is, when Lugansk and Donetsk declared independence, had the independence confirmed through a referendum, thereby meeting the United Nations need for self-determination. I know it's a sham referendum, guys. I know everybody's going to say that. From the Russian perspective, it wasn't. Just like, for instance, the Kosovo Declaration of Independence that NATO used to justify going to war in Serbia in 1999 didn't meet the same standard. Russia's just using the NATO standard. And so they recognize the independence of Lugansk and Donetsk. Now they form a collective security agreement, which means, because without this, Russia couldn't intervene. Because what happened in Donbass was an internal Ukrainian struggle between Ukrainian Russians and the Ukrainian government. But now that you make Donetsk and Lugansk independent, and they unite, because even then it doesn't work, because now it's two independent nations at war with Ukraine. Russia has no beef in this. But if you form a collective security agreement, now Russia is part of a collective security arrangement, and Russia can carry out preemptive self-defense. The preemption was the 60 to 100,000 Ukrainian troops that the United States has been training since 2015, who were based in eastern Ukraine, who were preparing, as they now acknowledge. I think a Ukrainian general just came out and said, yep, we're getting ready to launch a big offensive. So Russia said, we're not going to let that happen. And under the Caroline Doctrine, 1836, a U.S. ship up by the Canadian coast was sending arms over to then British Canada, and a British naval vessel attacked it. And they said, well, you can't attack an American ship. That's war. And the Brits said, nope, that's preemptive self-defense. You were carrying rebels and equipment. You were going to land them on the soil where they were going to attack the British. We have every right to preempt this. And the international courts have found that to be the case ever since. When NATO made its case about its intervention against Serbia, the Caroline decision was front and center in the legal justification for it, and it's front and center in the Russian justification for preemptive self-defense by attacking the people in Donbass. Now, people say, well, Scott, if they're just going to worry about the Donbass, why attack all of Russia? I don't know. Gosh, the Desert Storm, the war I was involved in, it was supposed to be about the liberation of Kuwait. A Chapter 7 resolution was passed by the Security Council authorizing military force to be used to liberate Kuwait. But we decided to liberate Kuwait, we had to go to war against all of Iraq. We bombed the living dupe out of it, everything. And when we launched the attack, it came through Iraqi soil. The famous left hook came up through southern Iraq, threatening the forces on the plain. We put airborne forces into southern Iraq. Iraq, not Kuwait. My point is, once a decision is made to go to war to accomplish an objective, you can use whatever means necessary to accomplish that objective because it's war or a special military operation disguised as war. However, now we're into semantics. War is war, people killing people is people killing people. But your question about the special military operation, you mentioned biolabs. I don't want to get too much into this because it's
huge.
it's a huge problem.
It's our same, right? The same. I mean,
Well, what I'm going to say is this: that when the Soviet Union fell, and I'll back this up by saying this: I'm personal friends with the people who ran the biolabs, who put the contracts in. So I'm going to start off by saying that I don't impugn any ill intent on their part. These are men and women of honor and integrity. And for me to believe that they were involved in something like that would be a bridge too far. So, but I'm going to explain why I'm saying what I'm saying. Soviet Union collapses, you have viable biological warfare facilities throughout the Soviet Union, to include Ukraine. One of the goals, when the Soviet Union collapsed, we, the United States, were worried about what happens to these laboratories, what happens to the deadly pathogens that were contained in them, but also as important, what happened to the scientists that worked there. Because let's say we can get rid of all the deadly pathogens. If we don't have viable employment opportunities for these scientists, they go off elsewhere and do their dirty deeds other places. So we came in, and under the Defense Threat Reduction Act, the Nunn-Lugar bill, cooperative threat reduction, millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars. We took over these labs, and we were supposed to get rid of the pathogens. One of the problems I have is when I'm reading what's going on, we have the head of the Defense Threat Reduction Agency responsible for Ukraine in February of this year saying, yeah, gosh, we're a little nervous if the Russians take over some of these labs because they're scientists being scientists, chuckle, chuckle, chuckle. There might be some of their old work in the refrigerators. Old work meaning the deadly pathogens that they developed during the Soviet Union, which they're not allowed to have. When the United States took over the laboratory, we took it over under the auspices of what's called the Biological Toxin Weapons Convention, a treaty to eliminate biological weapons, which says you are not allowed to retain biological weapons. Well, clearly we retained these biological weapons in the Ukrainian labs. They're there, and the Russians have them now. They know what's going on. The other thing that we're not allowed to do is produce offensive biological weapons. That's a violation. But here's the problem with the American interpretation. You see, I'll give you an example. I was a firefighter in New York, and I was a hazmat guy because of my experience in Iraq with weapons of mass destruction. So I was the hazmat guy, I was the WMD guy. So I went and got trained at all the federal facilities. For instance, I went to Anniston, Alabama, where we trained in live nerve agent. So we'd go in with Sarah nerve agent, VX nerve agent, we're wearing the gear. And the idea was to give us confidence to operate so that if anything really bad happened, we could say, we've been there, we've done that, we know how to do this, our equipment works, we have confidence. But here's the question nobody's asking. Who's sarin and who's VX? Where did that come from? Because isn't there a chemical weapons convention that bans this? It bans it. You're not allowed to have it, but we have it. And we have it in significant quantity because we're using it to train these firefighters. Well, you see, that's not offensive, that's defensive. That's our definition. But I can guarantee you that if the Iraqis decided that they wanted to have production capability to produce sarin and VX nerve agent and said, we're just doing it for defensive purposes, boys, we say, nope, violation, we're taking you out. We have a different interpretation. Remember the anthrax that got put around in the mail in October of 2001? Where'd that come from? Well, we know now, we know. It was produced in Dugway, Utah, by the equivalent of this facility where people like me go to train in a biological environment where we learn to operate with live anthrax agent operating. Where's that anthrax agent come? We produce it. We put it in a tube, it's a little tube, and they go up into the disseminator and they squeeze a little bit of it in there, seal it up, and it's disseminated out, and we come in and do our thing, and it's all cool and dandy, except that ain't defensive, ladies and gentlemen, because that same tube put stuff in an envelope, mailed it around, and became an offensive biological weapon. There is no distinction between defensive and offensive when you're dealing with the actual pathogens involved. And yet we do this all the time, and we were doing it in Ukraine. We were doing numerous programs that we described as defensive in nature, but the reality is that the material that are used in there can become offensive just by using it offensively. And we're dealing with biological agent. It doesn't take much to kill a lot of people. This is something the Russians were very worried about, and it's one of the things that they've been addressing through their special military operation. But here's the problem. They've captured the documents. They have all the documents. They have the agent. They have everything. And they did what they're supposed to. They went to the Security Council of the United Nations, and they filed a report, a claim. They wanted it to be investigated. The United States vetoed it. We won't allow it to happen because we don't want the truth to come out. So as American citizens, I would invite every one of you to write your congressmen or women and say, we need an investigation into what's going on in Ukraine. We need to know the truth about the American-funded and organized bioweapon lab in Ukraine. Yes, sir, in the back.
First off, you seem extremely enamored with Vladimir Putin. Said if it wasn't Putin, Russia would be what it is. That's it. Vladimir Putin today, called him uncorruptible, Iraq. What are your thoughts about Aleppo or Grozny or Georgia or the poisoning of political adversaries in London or what about those? It doesn't sound incorruptible or this does not sound like an incorruptible man.
What are my thoughts about Grozny? We'll start with Grozny. He's referring to the Chechen conflict. There were two, actually. One in the early 1990s, fought to a stalemate. left a anti-Russian, Islamic-oriented Chechen government in place, one that was being actively funded by the Central Intelligence Agency, where we were transferring Wahhabists from the Middle East to Chechnya to indoctrinate them into the ideology of hate and destruction against all things Russian. We were giving them weapons and training and guidance. So there was a second Chechen war. It was a bloody, brutal war. I'm not going to sit here and sing the praises of how the Russian army conducted itself. What I will say is this: when that conflict ended in 2005 with a Russian victory, Chechnya changed. Go to Chechnya today and compare and contrast Grozny today with what it was then and tell me that Russia did something wrong. Now we talk about Aleppo. I don't know what you want to talk about Aleppo. Aleppo was literally a Syrian government victory with Russian and Iranian assistance against a hateful Islamic extremist ideology that was holding a city hostage. Again, go to Aleppo today and compare and contrast the way it is today with what it was when those Islamist extremists were there, and there's no comparison. So I can't say they did anything wrong. What's the problem? Of course there's an Aleppo today. Well, I disagree with you. Okay, I've seen Aleppo. It's there. Okay, where's it ground the powder? Georgia, you got to be careful there because now you're talking about a place that my wife's from Georgia, so I know a lot about Georgia. What about Georgia? No, I'm not talking about my wife. I'm just telling you, I know Georgia very well. What's the problem with Georgia? No, but what's your problem with Georgia? I don't have an excuse. I have facts. Okay. No, I didn't mention the Holodomor.
We talked about the Slavic brotherhood of Russians and Ukrainians, but the Holodomor, which Germany yesterday recognized as a genocide,
Yeah.
which 16 other countries now recognize as a genocide, which 22 American states recognize as a genocide, in which 3 to 7 billion Ukrainians were killed through forced starvation, summary execution by the Stalin regime. I don't see how that can lead to brotherhood.
Okay, that's your point. I respect your point. Next point.
You have no comment.
I disagree with everything you say about the characterization of the Holodomor. Do you want to have a debate about it now, or we can do it later over a beer? It's up to you. Okay. Yes, sir.
That's not good enough.
With the potential climax of this conflict coming soon, do you have any concerns about NATO and Article 5, being drawn into the conflict when they reach that crisis point?
Yeah, here's the thing about NATO and Article 5 and such. Article 5 is the self-defense article. It's an attack against one is an attack against all. Article 5 has been implemented one time after 9/11. It was implemented not because Europe was running to help America, it's because America begged Europe to implement under Article 5 to create the political environment of the world coming to America's assistance. There was no combat under Article 5. Luxembourg flew some AWACS aircraft over American territory, and some ships were deployed into the Mediterranean to prevent refugees from coming to Europe. That was the only time Article 5 has been implemented. Article 4, on the other hand, is the war article. It's the most dangerous article of NATO. Article 4 is what NATO used to go to war against Serbia. Remember, a defensive organization carried out a war of aggression against a European nation. NATO, a defensive alliance, carried out a war of aggression against a European nation, Serbia, using Article 4. Article 4 is where NATO gets to come together and describe a situation that presents a security risk and determine what they're going to do about it. Article 4 was justified to go to war against Libya, a war of aggression. Article 4 was used to justify NATO's multi-decade involvement in Afghanistan, nation building. Article 4 is the most dangerous article, not Article 5. There will not be an Article 5 triggering event. Russia is not going to attack NATO. There's no reason for us to attack NATO. They don't want to attack NATO. It just isn't going to happen. The question is, what is NATO going to do in Ukraine? Right now, we have a NATO member, Poland, talking about perhaps annexing Western Ukraine, which used to be part of Poland back in the 1920s, 1930s, was stripped away in 1939, Ribbentrop-Molotov, Germans occupied, Russians won the war, reoccupied, stripped it back, gave it back to Ukraine. Poland believes that that's Polish territory. And so Poland is initiating internal domestic actions that could lead to a Polish intervention in Western Ukraine. If they do that void of NATO umbrella, then Poland will be defeated. Poland's only hope of success is to get NATO under Article 4 to deem the situation in Western Ukraine to be of such important security matter to European security that NATO is going to intervene, create a no-fly zone, create a humanitarian corridor to protect the refugees that are coming in. And now we have a situation where Russia could very well fight NATO troops on Ukrainian soil, Article 4, not Article 5. The other danger comes in Transnistria, Moldova. Right now, Ukraine is talking about, this is a breakaway republic, Moldova, and right now it's separated from main Russia part by the province of Odessa and Nikolaev. The Moldovans right now are saying they want it back. The Romanians are talking about helping the Moldovans bring it back. The Ukrainians are saying, why do we want to wait until Russia takes Odessa? Let's attack now. That's a big danger. Article 4 could be invoked under that. Article 4 could bring NATO and Russia into a war over Transnistria. The biggest threat to European security today is Article 4 of the NATO Charter. Yes, sir.
Why would Zelensky outlaw the Ukrainian Orthodox Church?
Why would Zelensky outlaw the Ukrainian Orthodox Church? Well, because we're dealing with symbols of nationality. The concern on the part of Zelensky is because of the significant Russian population in Ukraine, that the Russian Orthodox Church could actually hold sway over more people in Ukraine than the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. But this is an issue that predated the current conflict. Early on, before the war started, the Ukrainian church broke away from the larger Russian church family and started practicing on their own and starting to threaten the Russian Orthodox churches. And now, as part of this cultural genocide, we might call it, between the Ukrainians and the ethnic Russians of Ukraine, they're outlawing the Russian Orthodox Church. Yes, sir. I'll go until they stop asking questions.
Okay.
I promised them that I would answer their questions. Okay, so as long as you want to ask questions, I'll answer your questions. Yes, sir. You got to slow down, sir, because I'm deaf.
You're giving some sort of like Mickey Mouse reason for the escalation. You're talking about some generals that we're going to have a big escalation. We're going to have a big.
You got to slow down, please. I can't hear you.
You're giving Mickey Mouse reason for this escalation. You're talking about some generals said we're going to have a big offensive. The reason for it was that it developed a war of attrition. The DPR and LPR started losing, or went stale. That's the true reason for that.
So I don't understand your question. I'm going to come over here because I literally had things blow up in my head and I can't hear. I'll repeat your question.
You're giving some sort of like Mickey Mouse reason for it.
Okay.
You're saying some generals said we're going to have a big offensive. You're saying
Some generals.
no, you literally said a Ukrainian general said we're going to have a big offensive, and that's why they invaded.
Oh, yeah. No. Yeah. Okay. Go on. Yep.
The true reasoning for it is because the development was stalemate, basically a war of attrition. The LPR and GPR couldn't advance. That's why Russia did what it did. Am I correct?
No, but what's your question?
That's my question.
Okay.
Why am I wrong?
All right. No, I'll explain. All right. I got the question now. Yeah. The question is, I was giving Mickey Mouse reasons about why Russia launched their attack on Ukraine. That my reason that a Ukrainian general said there was going to be an attack against the Donbass is wrong. The real situation was that the LNR and DNR, the Lugansk People's Republic and the Donetsk People's Republic, had achieved a stalemate, were either being beat or it was stagnant and they couldn't advance. And that's why Russia came in to do what they did. Did I get your question right?
Yes.
Thank you. It's tough. I'm not being facetious here. I literally am deaf, so I couldn't hear you. Why are you wrong? Well, first of all, when Minsk started, do you know the numbers of troops that were in the LNR and DNR militias? 60 to 80,000. You know how many troops they had when the current invasion started? 10,000. Why? No, because they demobilized because of Minsk and because of Minsk 1 and Minsk 2. They demobilized. They sent people home because they believed that there was going to be a peace treaty. You know who didn't demobilize? How many Ukrainian troops were on the other side of the border when Minsk was started? I'll help you out, 30,000. How many were on the border when this war started? I'll help you out again, 60 to 100,000. The one side that was escalating numbers was the Ukrainian side. The side that was de-escalating numbers was the DNR and LNR. Who was weaker, who was stronger, who was prepared to launch the attack? It isn't fiction what the Ukrainian general was saying. Everybody recognized it. Say again? No, the media sources that reported them haven't provided me with the name.
There's mass graves in Donbass too.
I can't hear you.
There's mass graves in Donbass too somewhere, right?
I don't know, are there?
The same media sources said we found mass graves. So wait for them. I mean, this is like media sources said Trump colluded with Russia. This is the same like nonsense, dude.
You just call me dude? That's okay. I just wanted to, I just wanted to make sure. Look, the media isn't perfect. There's propaganda on both sides. There's disinformation, distortion. We'll find out when the history books are written. What we do know right now is that there are hundreds of thousands of Russian troops in Ukraine. We're getting to launch a major offensive. I don't know, does that come from a media source or am I making it up? No, I'm pretty sure they're going to launch a major offensive against the Ukrainian army that has been severely degraded. Am I making that up? Or I don't know. You tell me. But the point is, they're going to wipe the slate clean of these Ukrainians, and tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands are going to die. That's the reality. We can sit here and nitpick about history going in. The books will be written once the facts are all known. I agree with you that the media gets it wrong a lot. Sometimes things are said that aren't true. Some things aren't reported that are true. We'll find out. But we're here today to talk about how we stop a war in Ukraine. All right, so nitpicking on whether or not there's a mass grave somewhere in the DNR or LNR and the media got it right or wrong, I don't know, you tell me, is that relevant? I think what's relevant is how we prevent 700,000 Russian troops from sweeping in and creating a repeat of the destruction of Army Group Center with the Ukrainians running for their lives and getting machine gunned down before the advancing Russian tanks. I'd like to prevent that. Yes?
I've heard that NATO is weak and that there's a chance it could be dismantled. Is that a possibility?
The question is, she heard that NATO is weak and there's a chance that it could be dismantled. Let me answer the first part of that question. Weak is always a relative term. Weak as compared to what? I will tell you this, when I was in the military, when the Cold War was running, NATO wasn't weak. NATO had a large number of troops who were combat ready, who trained all the time. And one of the key elements of being combat ready is training. When I was in the Marine Corps, 29 Palms trained to fight the Russians, I was in the field 240, 250 days a year, consistently in live fire exercises, perfecting the art of killing Russians. That was it. That's all we did. We lived, breathed, fought it, slept it. That was my life. Now, the interesting thing about that is the moment we stopped training, I stopped becoming an efficient killer. Training has to be constant, and it's very expensive. And when the Cold War ended, we decided we didn't need to train like this anymore. It was too expensive. We wanted a peace dividend. So we stopped training to that level. We became less lethal. The other thing is the way we were organized to fight. During the Cold War, we were capable of fighting multiple corps level operations in parallel under an army group against the Soviets. Large scale ground combat, combined arms combat. Well, we had 300,000 troops on the ground in Germany, and we were going to deploy another 250,000 troops for 550,000 combat forces on the ground, thousands of aircraft, tens of thousands of tanks. That's all there. We could do it back then. Sometime in, I can't give the exact date, sometime in the 2000s, we withdrew the last tank from Europe. We went from having tens of thousands of tanks to no tanks. Weakness is a relative thing, but I'm here to tell you right now, tens of thousands of tanks is strong. 0 tanks is weak. Okay, now we take the Germans, the vaunted German military. They used to have numbers of divisions deployed, ready for defense, trained all the time, ready to fight on drop of the hat. They weren't willing to sacrifice a square inch of their territory to the Soviet invasion. They wanted to fight from the start. Then the Cold War ended, and the Germans said, we don't need this military anymore. They don't train, they don't equip, their stuff rots. In order to get a battalion deployed to Lithuania as one of the vaunted NATO battle groups, they had to cannibalize the existing armored brigades to get one battalion capable of deployment. That battalion is not combat capable. Combat capable implies combat proficiency. There's nothing proficient about that battalion. If a battalion got in a fight with the Russians today, that battalion would be destroyed on the first day of combat, because that battalion doesn't know what the reality of 30,000 rounds of high explosive ammunition impacting on your position. They've never trained for that. They're not prepared for that. And that's the rest of NATO too. NATO simply cannot fight the kind of war that's being fought in Ukraine today. NATO is a weak organization. It is a paper tiger. The British Army, so Mike drove me around, showed me the Michigan University football stadium. 110,000 people you can stuff in that thing? You could put the British Army in there and still have 40,000 empty seats. British Army. French Army deployed thousands of troops to Africa, Operation Sahel. Couldn't get to Africa without the US Air Force though, because they can't deploy. Europe can't fight. They don't know how to fight. They haven't trained to fight. They're not prepared to fight. Maybe they're going to wake up because of this war, but that costs money. Now we come back into the budget issue. Why is the NATO military the way it is? Because they didn't want to spend the money necessary, because Uncle Sam was there to back them up the whole time. Well, Uncle Sam has lost his combat capability. You know, we spent 20 years fighting a conflict in Iraq and Afghanistan. We are experts at killing wedding parties in Afghanistan and kicking down the doors of civilian homes in Iraq. What we're not experts at is waging large-scale ground combat in Europe. That is a totally different thing. We can take a brigade of the 101st Airborne and put them over there for a TV moment with CBS. Wow, 101st Airborne, don't they look good? They'll all be dead in a week, because 4,700 troops have zero sustainability in a modern combat environment. They need to be attached to hundreds of thousands of troops with significant amounts of artillery, air power, and logistics sustainability. And we already know that they will run out of artillery ammunition in 2 weeks. NATO is a paper tiger. Now, what's the future of NATO? Europe is starting to wake up to the reality that NATO is not a European security alliance. NATO is an extension of American national security policy. That the United States directs NATO to do that which benefits American national security policy. And there are many people in Europe right now saying, why are we destroying our economies backing Ukraine in this conflict? Why are we pretending that Ukraine was ever going to be a member of NATO when they never were going to be a member of NATO? Why are we sacrificing everything to engage in a conflict that only has one victor? The United States. The United States is the country that's benefiting most from this conflict, not Russia. The United States. Russia has talked about the need for a European security framework. In fact, they put 2 draft treaties on the table on December 17th of last year, one to NATO, one to the United States. They begged people, when we talk about diplomacy, they begged the United States and NATO, read the document, please. Sit down with us and talk with us responsibly. If you do this, we'll talk with you. We know you're not going to be happy with this, but we're willing to work with you. If you ignore it, you'll leave us no choice but to seek a military technical solution to the problem. That means war. We ignored them. War came. Cause and effect. We knew what we wanted to accomplish was to get Russia to invade Ukraine. We thought that the Russians' economy would collapse under the sanctions. It didn't. It boomeranged back. European economy is collapsing. We're now left with a much different position, with a Russian army beginning the mobilization. Understand this, Russia can mobilize all day. All day. We can't. NATO can't. Ukraine is what, in their 9th, 10th round of mobilization? They're taking old men, women. They got nothing left, ladies and gentlemen. Russia has just begun. If this is going to become a war of attrition, and it won't, because I think Russia's going to clean the slate soon, but if it does, Russia wins that war of attrition too. NATO's got nothing left, except men. They don't know how to fight. Take your average German trooper. That's all I'm going to say. Yes, sir.
When the United States announced itself as a sole superpower, that was really speaking to the American people. The USA is announcing itself as the sole superpower, and it means the sole imperialist power that plays with financial ruling classes to organize scenarios to make profit. And when you say the United States is benefiting from this war, it's that investor class that is somewhat global and focused here, that's benefiting from any war. And the profits from war are part of a global structure that wants to make profits from everywhere, but especially from war. And because it's global, it's not just about Russia, it's about China too. And I think when you speak to what's our responsibility as Americans, is to say if we want to be the sole superpower that's playing globally to make profits for investors, and if there's an off-ramp that has to do with recognizing the responsibility that we have as Americans to be in the middle of the sole superpower and all these financial military games to benefit only an investor class. And that's what I want to focus on.
No, that's a fair question. I'll try and condense it. If I get it wrong, raise your hand and say you got it wrong. Okay. Basically, at the end of the Cold War, the United States declared itself to be the sole remaining superpower on the earth. But that's beyond simply just stating the nation. It's about a system. We call it the rules-based international order that was imposed by the United States on the globe after the Second World War. This is various organizations, treaties, etc., arrangements, petrodollar, the dominance of the dollar is the global reserve currency. All of this together creates an environment of America dominating the world economically for its own benefit. And so when we talk about how to change this, we have to talk about that system that involves not just Russia, but other nations like China. Did I get it right? Okay. Well, investor class, but here, I'll answer about the investor class. Here's my response to that. The United States of America is a consumer-driven society. Does anybody disagree with this? No, you don't. You can't, because we are a consumer-driven society. We are a nation of consumers. Now, I know individuals will raise their hand. Not me. No. I applaud you. Good job. But the most of us are. We earn money. We spend money. We go shopping. How did we seek to resolve some of the major economic crises of the day? Presidents of the United States getting before the American people saying, go shop. That was the solution. Go shop. Go spend. Spend money. Why? Because as we consume, we wrap ourselves in a cocoon of comfort. And as long as we're in this cocoon of comfort, we're happy, we're warm, we're cuddly. We don't care about anything else. Just keep me wrapped in the cocoon of comfort. And that's what we do. And we don't want to rock the boat, because the second we rock the boat politically, we break free of that cocoon and we're not comfortable anymore. And a consumer-based society must be comfortable. We must have the illusion of gainful employment. We must have the illusion of the ability, if we can't accumulate wealth now, the American dream is that at some point in time we will, despite the fact that we're bankrupted by student loans, by high interest loans, mortgages, the whole work. It's a fake dream, ladies and gentlemen, but it's there nonetheless, and the vast majority of us buy into it. And so you say, how can we change this? I don't know, because it means a fundamental change in what we do. The United States of America today is a nation that consumes far more than we produce. Ask yourself, therefore, where does that which we consume come from? Well, it ain't America. It's the rest of the world. Now, if we really cared about people and human rights and all the things we pretend to care about, you'd think we'd want to pay market rate for this stuff, right? Isn't that fair? I mean, I go to the store, I see the coffee, and it's, there's the special kind of coffee you buy where we're saying we're helping the coffee farmers because we're paying them higher rates than the low rates that we get for the other coffee. I don't drink coffee, but my daughter's fiance does, and I try and buy it for him. So I can only get the farmer-friendly coffee because it's helping. But it's ridiculous, because the notion that that's going to change anything. Guys, the rules-based international order is about America dominating global economic and commercial interests. That's it. We have to dominate the world so that we can receive that which we consume at lower than market value, so that we can consume things that are priced affordably for the American consumer. You see, if we start pricing things too high, the American consumer stops buying it. We need to keep the prices low so the consumer spends because that's what makes our economy work. How do you get Americans to break free of that? And I don't have the answer because you're asking people to do that which is, it runs counter to what they're raised to do. The DNA of America is the American dream. A home, two-car garage, a job, a mortgage, a cat, a dog, some kids, a lawn, a lawnmower, a Christmas tree, Christmas present. We can go on and on and on, but it's all consumer driven. In order to get us to change this, we have to break free of that paradigm, and I don't have the answer. But you know who does have the answer? The rest of the world. You see, because the rest of the world is tired of playing the American singularity game. The rest of the world is tired of playing the game where the United States says, because you touched the dollar through the SWIFT banking system or anything else, we can sanction you. And other nations are going, but I'm not even doing business with you. I'm Iran trying to do business with France. Yes, but a dollar touched the transaction, so we can sanction you for doing business. It's illegal as hell, but America's doing it anyways. We sanction the world, citing American law, not international law. The world is tired of this. You know what else the world is tired of? Us doing things like seizing the $700 billion sovereign wealth fund of Russia that bought into the notion of a national reserve currency built on the dollar and the euro, and they put it in the currency reserve banks, and we said, we're seizing it. It's illegal, but we did it anyways. Why? Because we're America, we can do it. The world's tired of it. America built something called the G7, the group of seven. We built it. It's the 7 most influential economies in the world. Not anymore, though, thanks to the United States. You see, Germany, France, Great Britain, Italy, they probably shouldn't be members anymore because they're collapsing economies, not advancing economies. But the G7 then said, how do we control the world? We'll create something called the G20, the group of 20, the 20 largest things. But the world's tired of playing that game. So they came up with something called BRICS. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa said, we're not playing the G7, G20 game. And they came up with an alternative economic forum that represents multipolarity as opposed to American singularity. And now here's the fundamental question. When you take the G20 and you subtract the G7 from the G20, what do you get? BRICS. Guess who's taken over the world, ladies and gentlemen? BRICS, the multipolarity. And they're going to start dictating terms to us. That's how we break this paradigm. So the question isn't how we get America to change from within. The question is how we get America to accept peacefully what's about to happen, which is the world renegotiating the terms of coexistence with the United States economically. And as a consumer-driven nation, we're not ready for that. We're not ready for that, and that's the real danger we face. Sir, in the red, you've had your hand up forever.
So you suggested that Russia's reason for intervening in Ukraine is because they want to help protect the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics from Ukrainian aggression. Is that a correct general?
Yes.
Okay. Previously, earlier in your speech, you described NATO's intervention in Serbia as a war of aggression. But in that case, there were ethnic Serbs who were committing ethnic cleansing, forced deportations, and mass killings of ethnic Albanians who wanted to secede and form Kosovo. And NATO intervened to help protect them from that violence. So how is that a war of aggression when how is that a war of aggression when Russia is intervening in Ukraine with a much less logical pretext? There's been no ethnic cleansing against Russians in Ukraine. The current president of Ukraine is a native Russian speaker. How is that a defensive war when somehow the intervention in Serbia was an offensive war?
50 gold stars to the gentleman in the back. And I'm being a little facetious here. Before you start spouting off NATO propaganda, I will ask you the following questions. How many Kosovars were ethnically cleansed, murdered by the Serbians? Give me a number.
I think it was a few thousand.
Nope, keep going. Less, keep going. You see, the problem is it was a manufactured number. The CIA admits it. We made it up. Do you know what the Kosovo Liberation Army is? The KLA? They were a CIA-trained organization who was tasked by the CIA for carrying out operations inside Kosovo against Serbian populations to to provoke the Serbian army and security forces into reacting. There was one village, it begins with an R, Radek or something, I can't remember. Do you know it? It's a famous one. The media went all over there and filmed all the bodies lying out. Oh my God, look, they murdered everybody. Jesus Christ, it's horrible. They were all KLA fighters. There were no civilians involved in that. Okay, they were KLL fighters who were fighting them. Understand that what NATO called a genocide wasn't. And here's the important thing about Article 51, collective self-defense. The threat has to be imminent. Imminent. And the case made by NATO for the imminent need for intervention was a genocide that never happened. That's the difference. The threat against the Ukrainian or the Russian population of Donetsk was real. 8 years of documented bombardment that killed tens of thousands with 100,000, 60 to 100,000 Ukrainian forces ready to invade. That is genuine. That is real. It was an imminent threat. Russia responded. There's the difference. You see, when you study international law, you have to break things down into its components. And a key aspect of preemptive self-defense is the notion of the imminent threat that must be dealt with. There was no imminent threat in Kosovo. Therefore, the entire argument that NATO put together was a flawed argument, a legally flawed argument. Don't trust me. Trust the lawyers that actually write about this. And then when you take a look at the Russian argument for going into Ukraine, it is sustained over and over and over again by hard fact. That's the difference between the two. Yes, sir. No. No, that wasn't in Serbia. That was in Bosnia.
Do you feel that modern China has kind of set an example for the kind of direction that the world is going into outside of U.S. domination and sole influence, like you described earlier in the previous question?
Yeah, modern China setting an example. Well, I don't know about the example. I know they're outspending us. I sort of laughed when Biden got up in front of the G20 and begged them to come up with a $600 billion infrastructure investment fund. $600 billion. That's a lot of money. Except that the Chinese for the past decade and a half have been spending $7 to $10 trillion on the Belts and Roads Initiative. And they're out there building supply chain relationships with the world. And when they go in, the Chinese don't do things like we do. You see, when America comes in, we come in and say, we're going to give you this aid, but you have to ban abortion. You have to do this. You have to do that. You have to do this. We put all the strings on it. And nations don't like to be lectured to like that. To give you a prime example, Tony Blinken went to South Africa just recently this past summer and met with the South African, they call it the External Affairs Minister, a very intelligent lady. And she said, we Africans don't like having you Americans and Europeans telling us what we can and we can't do. We aren't colonies. We're not your slaves. We're a sovereign nation, and we get to make sovereign decisions to include who we trade with and why. And we will trade with Russia regardless of this because we don't agree with your assessment about this conflict. We happen to believe this conflict began with the expansion of NATO, with the aggression that forced Russia into a corner. We're not happy about the Russian invasion because it's a war, but we're not going to stop trading with Russia. And Blinken went, oh, well, we don't do that anymore. We don't do that anymore. That's not how we operate. We listen, we obey. The next day, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations was in Uganda telling the Ugandan government that if you continue to trade with Russia, there will be repercussions. We can't even be consistent in the policies that we claim. The Chinese don't do that. The Chinese aren't perfect. I'm not up here singing the song about China. They come in with some unfair trade practices. They take advantage of their wealth. They leverage debt in a way that gives them control of facilities that they default on the loans. But I'll say this about the Chinese. In every instance where a nation has said, we can't afford this, we're going to default, the Chinese came in and forgave billions of dollars on the top. When was the last time the United States went in and forgave billions of dollars? No, we renegotiate the loans with the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank to come in and have a new term that lengthens the control that we have over their economy, because that's what it's all about, baby, the rules-based international order and American unilateral control of the global economy. The world is fed up with that. China first and foremost. They're winning the game. I'll give you an example. Barack Obama created something called the Trans-Pacific Partner. I'm getting this wrong. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, right? The whole idea of the Trans-Pacific Partnership was to create this massive free trade association in the Pacific. But who was left out? China. The whole idea was to create this massive trade relationship that kept China out, that walled them off, because we're America. We can do anything we want. Well, the problem is Donald Trump came in and said, that's stupid. It's costing us money. He dissolved it. Genius move, Donald, because you know what the Chinese did? They came in and built an even bigger trade alliance with all those people plus some. It's the biggest free trade alliance in the world. And guess who's not a member of it? The United States. We're on the outside looking in. So the world's changing. The Chinese are doing it better than we are. I'm not saying that it's the ideal model, but you know what? It's their model, and it's working for them. Yes, sir.
I grew up in China, so I think consistent community in China. I don't agree with your comment. In all your today's talk, you need to differentiate between the dictator, the leader of the country, and the country, the common people of the country. Okay? Yes, China is winning economically, military to the United States, but the United States have the responsibility to involve China's human rights, all those things.
We have a responsibility for what?
To involve, to promote human rights.
To involve ourselves in the human rights of China.
Yes,
We have a duty and responsibility.
yes.
Under what authority?
Because you said the reason that Putin, the dictator of Russia, is waiting for it is because he wants to protect Russian people in Ukraine, right? If they can do that, why U.S. do not want to protect human rights? Okay, I think the kind U.S. United States, that's the reason we come from the United States, because the value, right? The common world value we come from.
Specifically how?
Oh, that's in politics. We tell them if you using the laborers, children, for example, if you're using children laborers, you use the president to generate some good. We do not partnership with it. We consistently tell them you have to respect human rights. Otherwise, majority China is suffering. Even though so, today China economic is booming, but they only make small portion of people, the elite, the dictator, those people rich, the common people, the people who grew up with me, they're suffering. Okay? Without the United States involvement,
No, I'm not. I'm just.
you are promoting China is
Okay.
successful, those people will suffer.
I appreciate your. I know where you're coming from, and you're morally correct.
Yeah, okay.
All right. Let me tell you what's going to happen if we do what you do. You ready? First of all, America has no legal obligation to go into China to protect human rights. That's purely a sole prerogative of America. There's no United Nations authority. There's not a Chapter 7 resolution. It's nothing. It's America imposing its will on China. And you really want Americans to impose their will on China? Do you think Americans understand China? You want people ignorant about China coming in telling China how to run its own business? It's a mistake.
I don't want the United States force their value in China. I want to force your value to the people, to help the common people.
But what are the common people? Do we get to dictate?
It's the government against the common value. It's not the China.
Well, let me put it this way. We're not the world's policemen. China has problems, and I agree China has problems. You solve them. It's not my problem. Here's the other reality. You produce a lot of stuff that makes the American consumer happy. You want to know how we lose the China debate? Stop bringing the PS5 or whatever the hell that new game is. If I take the PS5 off the stands right now for Christmas, because it's the holiday season right now, and every American family wants to get one of those damn toys to mollify their children who are screaming, I gotta have the new computer game. And if I can't get that new computer game, my children are unhappy, I'm unhappy. And if we do what you say, we're not gonna get the new computer game because they're built in China. Just like everything's built in China. China controls the supply links. What you're suggesting is something that cannot be done. It's impossible to do because to hold China accountable to the standard you say, we have to put sanctions on China.
No, we're doing the American consumer is very good, okay? Because American consume a lot of food from China, that's make China rich. Because make the Chinese people economic booming. Because you buy stuff from China. That's good.
Well, then how do we control the policies of China?
Until today, China, talking to China's human rights is very good because last week, China had a demonstration against the lockdown.
Yeah. No, I know, I'm familiar.
Because the government rate of China, US going to sanction them, this time it didn't happen, demonstrate very good. Just because that. If United States government do not tell the Chinese about human rights, keep talking about that, they're going to tell the people demonstrate.
All right, I appreciate your standpoint.
Americans do not have the right to involve China, but morally, we need to have Chinese.
Okay, but here's my problem.
You also mentioned the Chinese government.
I understand.
Come on.
What gives America the moral authority to do this?
Chinese tax money, not.
What gives America the moral authority to do this?
Yes.
What gives America the moral authority? You know how many prisoners we have in prison today? Do you understand that we have a nation that are full of problems? Here's the problem. Joe Biden, in his recent national security strategy of the United States, has said that which makes America the indispensable nation in the world is the power of our democracy. Please laugh, because that's a punchline. The power of our democracy. And we're going to tell China how to do things, what to do, what to put the moral compass. We are broken as a nation. Republicans hate Democrats. Democrats hate Republicans. Independents are confused. Black hates white. Yellow hates brown. We're a nation that's fundamentally broken. We are falling apart at the seams. And yet you're telling me that we somehow have the moral authority to dictate to China about human rights when we don't meet any of the standards here at home. That's the problem.
Yes. Even though Americans have a program, but still the democratic system in the United States is much better than China, better than Russia, better than Africa. That's the reason that we have the moral to have those undeveloped countries.
Okay.
Yes, we agree. Yes, United States government is corrupt. They have lots of programs. Does not mean we cannot help the people, right? I'm not rich, okay?
Neither am I.
But I have the responsibility to help the people for them. That's the
Right. I'll leave it with this. I respect everything you say and I understand where you're coming from, but I'll also say this, and I hope you admit that I'm right on this one. You're Chinese, you said.
No, I grew up in China. I come to Harvard 30 years ago.
Correct. But what I'm saying is you have a vested interest in China. You have
invested interest in Chinese people.
Correct.
Not the government, not the
I'm not disagreeing with you. What I'm saying is you're informed about China. You have knowledge and information about China. You are personally vested in a good solution for the Chinese people. No one else here is. They might theoretically talk about how they care about the Chinese people. Nobody has your background, your experience, and the level of investment, and there's your problem. This is personal for you. But the average American doesn't take this personally. The average American's concerned about that cocoon of comfort I talked about. I know, I come from the same thing. My wife is from Georgia, and she is sick to her stomach about what's going on in Georgia and what has happened to Georgia. She takes it personally. It's a personal issue, and she's frustrated that the United States doesn't share her values because they're about human rights. They're about all the things you talked about. But nobody in this room knows a damn thing about Georgia, and nobody's willing to put their life on the line for Georgia, and not a single American should be willing to put their life on the line for China. And that's the ultimate problem. Because once you start the ladder of escalation on these issues, where do you draw the line? If we make human rights such a moral thing that we have to be engaged, what happens when China doesn't play ball? Where do we take it from there? To the point where I have to jab a bayonet into a Chinese man's chest? No, we don't want that. So I say we have to back down to where we can deal with the Chinese, and that has to be with respect for the totality of China, inclusive of its government. That's my point of view. I understand where you're coming from. And we're at one of those crossroads. Next question.
In January of this year, Russia was saying they did not intend to launch any military operations.
Yep.
And then they were saying, at the same time, they were saying they were alarmed at what they said was an escalation in combat.
Yep.
Okay. And in fact, they even said the OSCE, which monitors it, they said that they were glossing over this. So my question to you is, do you think they were lying about their intentions in January, or do you think maybe they did change their plans as a result of those escalations?
Well, Russia never lied about this, and I'll tell you why. The troop movements were real. So Russia's like, yeah, we're moving troops on our own border. You can think of it what you want, but we're exercising these troops. We're concerned about what's going on in Donbass. If you recall, they started moving these troops in early 2021. That's why Joe Biden flew to Geneva to meet with Vladimir Putin to discuss in June 2021 to discuss this issue. And the Russians pulled back. Why? Because Joe Biden in Geneva promised that he would engage with Ukraine about Minsk. He said, I will put pressure on Zelensky to implement the Minsk Accords. In October, and he said he will call up the Germans and the French, who were co-sponsors for this. In October, the Russians held a high-level meeting with the Germans and the French. They said, hey, are you going to implement Minsk? And the Germans and the French went, no, we're not going to do that. They made the phone call to Biden. I thought you said you're going to make the phone call, make this stuff happen. Nah, we're not going to do that. Minsk is off the table. We're talking about Minsk 3 now. We want to come up with a new Minsk thing. The Russians go, no, we have a negotiated settlement here. It needs to be implemented. No, Minsk 3 is what we want. And the Russians went, we're not doing Minsk 3. You guys can't be negotiated with. And that's when the Russians put the draft treaties on the table in December and said, this is the solution. Since you guys are playing games, this is the solution. A new European security framework. Don't ignore it. If you ignore it, a military technical solution will be had. We ignored it. We ignored it sometime in mid-January. And at that point in time, Russia began the diplomatic and legal processes necessary to create the conditions for an invasion of Ukraine. A war with Ukraine could have been stopped in January if the United States picked up the phone and demanded that the Ukrainian government implement Minsk. That's just a plain, simple fact. The decision to invade wasn't made prior to that. The potential was there with military, because you don't simply build up 200,000 troops ready to carry out sustained military combat overnight. So the Russians built up that capability, but they would have happily dispersed that capability had Minsk been implemented. It wasn't. Yes, sir. I'm sorry, what, ma'am? Why didn't Biden follow through? Because the policy of the United States is not to create peace with Ukraine, it's to destroy Russia. It's been the policy of the United States since the fall of the Soviet Union. Remember the reset, the famous reset under Obama? The little red button in the yellow box? Hillary, Lavrov pushed the button. It's spelled wrong. It meant something totally different. It meant overcharged. So if you push the button, our relationship gets overcharged, not reset. Reset was regime change. Reset was, we are going to create policies that empower Medvedev to stay as president to keep Putin out. Joe Biden flew to Moscow in March of 2011 at the height of the election period, and he spoke to Russian opposition leaders. Now just put this through your mind for a second. Imagine a Russian leader flying to America and talking to an American political party and saying the following: Joe Biden shouldn't run for re-election. It would be bad for Joe Biden. It would be bad for America. We'd be pretty angry, wouldn't we? Well, Joe Biden went to Russia and told Russian opposition leaders that Vladimir Putin shouldn't run for re-election. It'll be bad for Putin. It'll be bad for Russia. Biden's been against Russia from day one. He's part of the regime change. It failed. He was part and parcel of the 2014 coup d'etat. Remember, Biden ran Ukrainian policy. He ran Ukrainian policy. The coup was Biden's coup. And so this war is Biden's war.
Because of Biden and Zelensky, Zelensky now so blindly killing Ukrainians and everybody else.
Yep. Over you, sir.
Zelensky's worth $1.6 billion.
Allegedly, I don't have evidence of that. Go ahead. No, one behind you.
I'd be interested in your perspective on what you see the long-term fallout of the United States supplying arms and weapons money to Ukraine with our relationship with Russia.
Well, with our relation with Russia, I think, okay, the question is, what's the long-term fallout of our supplying all these weapons and money to Ukraine with our relation to Russia? Our relations with Russia are ruined. We have no relations with Russia. There's nothing going on right now. It's zero. This is a very dangerous situation. So how do we repair this? Well, here's a couple issues. One, look, the Russians are grown-ups. And what I mean by that is the following. In the 1980s, the United States spent a lot of money creating something called the Mujahideen. We funded them in Afghanistan. for the sole purpose of killing Soviet troops. And we killed them by the thousands. The Soviets withdrew from Afghanistan in 1989, I believe. I was a weapons inspector in Russia at the time. Did the Russians run around and say, we hate you because your CIA has been killing Russian troops in the Soviet Union, or were they adults? And they said, we were playing the big game, we lost, we're out of there, we're still going to work with you. That's the Russian approach. Let's talk about the American approach now. Let's go to Iraq, 2005. We're occupying the country, by the way, as an illegal occupation, and people are resisting. The Shia population is resisting. They're getting help from this organization called the Quds Force, operating out of Iran, commanded by a guy named Qasem Soleimani. And Qasem Soleimani's doing the job better than we're doing. He's killing 600 Americans. And he helped create an insurrection that caused America ultimately to withdraw. Did we handle it like grown-ups? Say, well, we overextended ourselves. We got a little overextended. That's the way it is. We're just going to move on. Or did we hold a grudge? Such a grudge that we assassinated Qasem Soleimani when he landed in Baghdad with a proposal for peace. That's how America operates. You see, we hold grudges. Russia doesn't, and that's my point. Russia will get out of this. Russia will take the adult approach. They're not going to hold this grudge forever. The question isn't how we lure Russia to the table. It's how we win Russia's trust to the table, what we have to do as a nation. And I believe that the first element of that is arms control. Look, Russia's going to win this war. I know there's people that disagree with that assessment. That's okay. We can have a conversation in 6 months. What?
I think it's going to, you're looking at me, right?
Yeah, I'm looking at you.
I think they're going to get the DPR out here.
How about Crimea? You get the whole Crimea? How about Kherson? Zaporizhia goes back too? Okay. We'll see. I mean, history will see. But the point is, what's going to... Oh. It's okay. It's okay. It's good. Okay. It's okay. Thank you. No. Everybody's allowed their own opinion. Everybody's allowed their own. Partner, everybody gets their own opinion. Everybody gets their own opinion. And I know you're upset. He's upset with me. You're upset with him. We have a triangle of upset going on here. It's okay. It's okay. We're just going to talk our way through this. And when this all ends, like I said, the history books will tell us who's right. And so in 6 months, we can have this conversation. They know how to get in touch with me, and I'd be more than happy to speak with you about it. To finish the answer to your question, which I lost track of, quick refresh. How do we get out of this? Yeah. I think the key right now, first of all the arms we're providing Ukraine, they're going to be destroyed. Okay, that's the quickest way. When Russia says demilitarization, that's going to be part of it. All the American wealth that's gone to Ukraine will either be in Russian possession or destroyed. The problem is with the light weapons. And we're seeing that, the NLAWs, which is a British weapon, the Javelin, which is an American weapon, the Stinger, an American weapon. There's other equivalents out there. Man-portable weapons, including light arms, munitions, grenades, etc., are appearing on the black market around the world. They're appearing in South America. They're appearing in the Middle East. They're appearing in Africa. They're appearing in Europe. Because Ukraine is the single most corrupt nation on the face of the earth, and the money we're providing Ukraine, the weapons we're providing Ukraine, lacks any accountability. Rand Paul stood up, and Rand Paul, he'll boo his. The guy stood up and said, before we give $43 billion, why don't we have an inspector general who can account for it? Wouldn't that be nice, especially after the Afghanistan debacle, where we left $9 billion worth of weaponry on the battlefield for the Taliban to take? Why don't we account for this? Can we answer the question, what happens to the NLAW or the Javelin when we send it to Ukraine? They received it. Who did you give it to? A combat unit. Did they sign for it? Was it issued to a soldier? Did he sign for it? This is what normal militaries do, baby, even in wartime. You sign for the weapon. When you use the weapon, your officer writes a report that says Private Schmuckatelli fired 3 Javelin missiles. The following serial numbers are accounted for. They go back to a logistics guy who checks them off a list. They're accounted for. So when I do my forensic analysis afterwards, I can say I know exactly what happened to every weapon I gave the Ukrainians. We don't have any of that in place. So instead it goes there, and the Ukrainians who have empowered criminals, the Azov battalion, the Adar battalion, Kraken battalion. I could keep going. All these neo-Nazi people who are affiliated with organized crime networks in Europe receive these weapons with no accountability, and they want to put some cash in their pocket. So they sell it on the black market and they cash it up. And that's where we're at today. This is a very dangerous situation that's going to haunt the world for decades to come. But that, even then, the Russians are going to get over that because that's a self-inflicted wound. That's the West killing itself. The key to get out of this thing, I believe, is arms control. I believe that the most important thing here is that which kills us all, and that's nuclear weapons. And the one thing about this conflict is that it has put the potential of nuclear conflict up there front and center for all people to consider. And what we need to do is re-engage responsibly about arms control. And here's my last pitch for the book. Disarmament in the time of Perestroika, arms control in the end of the Soviet Union is a template for hope. It shows you how we did it once before. And I believe we could do it again, but America's going to have to change the way it approaches this. The reason why arms control worked back then in the 1980s is that we respected the Soviet Union. We feared them, but we respected them. We took them seriously. So if we're going to have arms control with Russia, we have to respect Russia. We have to take them seriously. We even have to fear them a little bit. We're not there yet. Yes, sir.
Going back to the topic we discussed a long time ago, but I guess
Okay, I'm going to have to come up to you again because I literally can't hear.
I know that, like, during your speech, you talked a lot about, I guess, like, the history of, I guess, the relationship between, like, NATO and Russia, right? And then you also mentioned that, like, Russia effectively thought that they would be able to, like, do their military operation relatively quickly, and then that, like, you know, be able to do peace negotiations in Turkey, and then that would essentially bring an end to the military operation. So I guess my question is, why, in your view, did, like, Russia not expect NATO to get involved, given all of the history?
Okay, good question.
I just would like to suggest that this might be the last question, because Mr. Ritter has to do this all again tomorrow.
I do.
Yes. So, last question.
We didn't negotiate that. I reject this. Where's my union? Where's the speakers union? Okay, your question basically dealt with, I gave a lot of explanation about what Russia expected, how they got it wrong, et cetera, et cetera. Why didn't Russia anticipate NATO getting involved the way they did? I don't know. I mean, that's a question only the Russians can answer. Because logic, I would tell you that if I were briefing Putin, I would say that there's a good chance that NATO will seek to be involved. Early on was Poland deciding they want to take advantage of the chaos to make a move on Western Ukraine. Russian intelligence has been talking about this for some time, and any Pole who lives in Poland will tell you that the nationalists are making that very case right now. So that's an issue. But I think Russia made it clear that any direct NATO involvement in Ukraine would be treated by Russia very seriously, and they would respond with every capability in their system. A lot of people thought that meant nuclear weapons. Maybe it did, maybe it didn't. Russia never said. But it meant that Russia was going to take any NATO intervention very seriously. And maybe Russia thought that NATO would look at that and say, we don't want to get involved. I think NATO made a decision that couldn't have been predicted up front. Because again, I just challenge anybody right now to tell me on February 24th that you could predict that Russia would withdraw its forces from around Kiev on March 25th. How many people could predict that? No one. And the reason why is because war is unpredictable. The plan of action gets thrown away on initial contact with the enemy. Stuff happens. So the Russians now were in a situation where they thought we're going to withdraw and invite peace. I don't think that anybody in Russia thought that NATO would misconstrue the Russian actions as a sign of weakness. See, that's the tipping point analytically. Somebody in NATO said Russia's losing. Russia can't win. The Russian army is defeated. The Russians are retreating. Therefore, we will now intervene to empower the Ukrainians toward this victory. And so we sent tens of billions of dollars, a massive training program. We trained them up in France and England and in Germany and Poland. And they came in and they launched a very impressive counteroffensive in September, capturing large swaths of territory in Kharkiv and capturing territory in Kherson. But that's not a victory. That's just Ukraine burning through its troops. And Russia saying, we're going to trade space for lives. And now Russia's mobilized and Ukraine's got nothing. Russia didn't expect NATO to make that gambit. I don't think Russia expected NATO to get it so wrong, to think that Russia was defeated. How could you think Russia was defeated? The 200,000 troops were peacetime manning. There was no wartime escalation prior to this incursion. The 200,000 were peacetime forces brought together. There was no declaration of war. There was no special parliamentarian procedures other than recognizing the Donetsk and Lugansk. What Russian analyst would sit there and say, yeah, we beat Russia? Russia didn't even mobilize. Russia wasn't even trying. Now Russia's trying. And there ain't nobody saying that Russia's losing right now. Ain't nobody saying Russia's going to be swept off the battlefield. Ain't nobody saying Ukraine's going to prevail. Well, you are, but maybe you're right. So that's where we're at. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Facebook's out there for sale along with the earlier book, and he will be speaking again tomorrow in the main library at 12.